Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 31. The Blackened Battlefield. What is taking them so long? Khazar's impatient hiss, barely audible over the sounds of battle in the distance, only heightened Felicity's anxiety. Something is wrong, Marnan whispered, craning her head through the leaves to try to see the tower from their hiding spot in the foliage. Perhaps we should take the initiative. Mila's voice floated down from above them. She was perched somewhere in the trees to watch for the signal. No, Marnan said through gritted teeth. If we attack without the added threat of Loghain's men, half the horde will turn around and crush us. Bring it on, Khazar growled. Felicity was shaking, by now. The rain was colder than any she'd experienced before, in her short time out of the tower, seeping into her robes and through her shoes. Her ears and nose were numb with it, despite the hooded cloak she had pulled over her head. There was some weak ice salve in her pack, but she was loath to use it for something so mundane, when there was the possibility of encountering emissaries wielding frost spells in the near future. That was, if the beacon would light. What was taking Alistair and the others so long? Marnan, Felicity whispered, you don't think they encountered trouble, do you? Dahalam. It's lit. What? Mila's voice revealed her relief. The beacon was lit just now. Marnan sighed. Thank the ancestors. Felicity heard shifting as the dwarf pushed up from the undergrowth. Felicity did her best to extricate herself, stifling a groan. Her limbs ached both with cold and with crouching down for so long. Through the gloom, she could see Khazar's petite form stretching as he stood next to her. Presently, Mila dropped out of a tree and joined them. All right. Our job is to cull the horde from behind, Marnan said, fixing a helmet over her head. At some point during their stay at the camp, it seemed she'd gotten a suit of plate armor made for herself. Target emissaries and lieutenants as a priority, and don't make targets of yourself by just attacking wildly. Yeah. The elven mage rolled his eyes. Can we just go kill stuff now? Khazar, she's talking mostly to you, Felicity pointed out. Marnan turned toward her. Felicity, I want you to try to keep out of sight as best you can. I have a feeling things could get pretty hot. I don't want you needlessly endangering yourself. Felicity nodded, more than happy to comply with that. Mila deftly strung her bow and nocked an arrow. I am ready. Good. Marnan sighed, hefting her axe. Let's move out. The four of them ran through the foliage of the wilds, heading around the base of the Ostagar cliffs, toward the sounds of battle. It wasn't long before they broke through the trees and came upon the sight of the Darkspawn horde slicing hard through the Ferelden lines. Felicity peered through the rain, trying to figure out who still stood, but she couldn't tell from this distance. Mila was the first of their group to attack, her arrow catching a Hurlock emissary mid-spell. Then, Khazar lit up the Darkspawn with fire, and it was all Felicity could do to fling the occasional sputtering spell bolt and wait for the inevitable. And there it was, a group of archers near the downed emissary turned to them, and the four Grey Wardens ducked behind cover as arrows filled the air around them. Khazar shortly responded in kind, and ice streaked across the ground the Darkspawn stood upon, freezing their legs in place, making them easy targets for Mila. A force of Darkspawn melee fighters broke away from the horde to come toward them across the rain-dampened ground, only to be scattered by a well-placed fireball. A handful stood back up despite scorched skin, and kept the charge. However, Marnan stepped up to meet them with axe swinging, well before they got to the ranged wardens. Felicity felt another rain of arrows rush past them, and reached over to touch Mila on the shoulder, giving her a burst of healing that closed up the new gash on her upper arm. The Dalish elf nodded her thanks. Khazar grinned gleefully not far off, fire and lightning shooting from his fingertips to the point of excess. The younger mage never had much grasp on the concept of mana conservation. However, Marnan's plan seemed to be working. The elven mage was decimating the Darkspawn backline. The field was now set ablaze in several places despite the rain, and blackened Darkspawn corpses littered the ground in their corner of the horde. An enemy's lightning spell streaked through them, making Felicity yelp with both surprise and burning pain. Immediately, she pushed a healing spell through herself to repair what had been burned, then hurried around to do the same to the other three. Khazar growled and responded in kind, sending lightning of his own to the emissary who had attacked them. Marnan killed the last of the current darkspawn wave, and raised her axe again as more broke away from the horde to head toward them. Wherein the ancestor's name is Loghain. Felicity jerked her head up, realizing that the reinforcements should have been here by now, crashing into the horde from the other side. But she looked around and only saw more and more darkspawn emerging from the forest behind the horde. It seemed the darkspawn army in front of them wasn't even the entire force their enemy had. Marnan, Felicity hissed, pointing to where it appeared the darkspawn were getting reinforcements, rather than the king's men. Might of the Paragons. What is this? Suddenly, a yelp sounded from next to them, and Khazar stumbled back 3 steps, wavering on his feet. Felicity rushed forward to help steady him, only to see, to her horror, an arrow shaft sticking out of his upper chest, just under his collarbone. The elf's lithe fingers gingerly touched the growing red spot around the shaft. I'm bleeding. Khazar stuttered in shock, color draining from his face. Felicity surged healing into him, but dared not remove the shaft. It went in deep, so deep that it may very well poke through the other side, and puncture some vital organs along the way. She couldn't heal all that, not in time to save him, not without proper bandaging. Perhaps not even then. Marnan. Felicity called, holding Khazar upright as the other mage's legs buckled. She looked over her shoulder, only to see the dwarf engaged with another group of darkspawn that had broken off toward them. Sparks fizzled feebly from Khazar's hands. Stop that. Save your energy. She scolded, though she wasn't sure whether he heard her, with his eyes glazing over like that. Come, Mila's voice spoke, and the Dalish elf moved to keep the slumping elf upright from the other side. We must get him to safety, or he'll perish. Agreed, Marnan gasped, shoving the last of the darkspawn to the ground and cleaving its head in 2. We must retreat, she said grimly. This battle is lost, and we'll just die dashing ourselves upon the stone if we don't. Felicity cast a look over the battlefield, hoping to see Loghain's men crushing the horde, or the king's men pulling off a miraculous victory. But all she saw were more black, tainted shapes. Many of them approaching, far too many to hold off without Khazar. Move out. Marnan said. When she felt Marnan's hand push at her lower back, Felicity wrapped one of Khazar's arms around her shoulders, and Mila did the same with the other arm, and both started running through the foliage with the young elf dangling between them. Khazar stifled a shriek behind clenched teeth as they started moving, and Felicity poured more creation magic into him, doing her best to knit up whatever internal damage that arrow shaft was causing. They needed to find safe, dry ground before she could address it properly, but this should at the least keep him going. Theoretically, anyway. Hearing the roaring of the battle continuing behind them, Felicity could only stumble through the underbrush with the others, hearing the grunting of pursuit behind them and hoping that Alistair and the others would at least get out of this mess alive. 32 The Survivor's Curse. The clashing of steel was all around him, a symphony of pain as he dodged and ran. And the form in his arms was growing so cold and so still. Only the body's occasional whimpering gasps indicated that he was still on this side of the veil. He roared out his pain, using the shield still clasped in his hands to both bash through the attackers and defend that delicate, mangled form. Blades slashed into him from behind, but he only used that pain to find the strength he no longer had, to turn around and throw himself at those that sought to cut him down while protecting his new charge. He was fury. He was vengeance. He was rage. And then, at last, the darkness closed in, and even that strength failed him. They closed in around him as he fell to his knees, still curling protectively over the shuddering form in his arms. He couldn't let them take another. No more. Please, Maker. Don't take another one. And then he woke up. Percival jerked upright with a gasp, a jolt of remembered pain lancing through him. Where was his sword? He had to fight, had to. Oh, do calm down, dear. You're safe enough, for the moment. He whipped around in his seat at the voice, only to gasp as pain lanced through his back and over his shoulders. They'd slashed through his armor in places, he recalled. He was sitting on a pallet in a small hut, sunlight filtering in through the windows on each wall. In the distance, birds chirped and frogs croaked, and the air was fresh with subtle herbal scents. The dichotomy was jarring, after the remembered frenzy of the battle, Percival had to breathe deeply to calm his stuttering heart. Across the room, there was a bed. That was where the voice had come from, for a familiar old woman sat on the edge of it, putting together a poultice in her lap. In the bed was a familiar elf, very drawn and very still. "Is he alive, for now?" Flemeth said, not looking up from her work. "Though it is hard to say what his future holds. Then again, can the same not be said for anyone?" Carefully, now mindful of the healing cuts along his back, Percival climbed to his feet. He was aware of his knees twinging, bruises fading on the caps, but he didn't pay it any mind. He'd been stripped down to his trousers, and didn't know how he felt about this strange wild woman being the one to do so. Well, perhaps better her than Morgan. Percival cast his gaze around for the younger witch, but it was just the two of them in the hut. "No, three," he told himself firmly, walking carefully over to the bedside. It made his heart sink, seeing the elf like this. Since Percival had first met him, Finian had always been all smiles and motion and brightness. To see him draped in sheets, broken and still, was as good as seeing him put on a pyre. Just like Davith. Just like his family. "You healed us? You? Why? Might I take that as a thank you, young man?" The old woman's mouth tipped in a knowing smile. "No matter. In answer to your question, my reasons are my own. Suffice to say that I want the oncoming blight to succeed no more than you do, and it would certainly be hard to ensure its failure without Grey Wardens." Without. Percival's mind flitted back in time. The battle. What happened at the battle? Why are we here, and not at Ostagar? The witch did not answer right away. She carefully wrapped up the poultice and pulled the sheet off the elf to place it on one splinted leg. Percival looked away, because Finian's body was black and swollen in more places than not, and that thigh bone had definitely been broken, though at least now it was set and splinted. As Percival was looking at the hut's hearth, he realized that each breath Finian took was accompanied by a soft wheeze. Percy shuddered. "Ostagar is lost, I'm afraid," Flemeth finally said, and Percival turned back to see her covering the elf again. "By the time I got there, you four were the only ones I could salvage. The rest of them have long since fallen to the dark spawn." Percival's world rocked. We lost? But certainly, some must have survived." "Oh, some certainly did. The forces of that Loghain boy, it seemed, never stepped onto the field at all." She turned and fixed Percival with that too knowing gaze. "But as for the rest of them, the members of your order, for example, no. There were no others that Morgan or I could find." Percival felt it again, that emptiness opening up inside him. Duncan. Kalen. Hugo. The other wardens. Suddenly, the hut seemed far too small, and far too quiet. He stumbled to the door and burst through it. He barely registered the door banging against the side of the hut, nor the way that made the other warden standing outside jump. An ever-growing list of names rattled around in his head as he staggered to the edge of the swamp. Father, Mother, Orin, Oriana, Iona, Malol, Aldous, Nan, Ser Gilmore, Fergus Davith, Ser Jory, Duncan, Kalen, Hugo, Marnan, Felicity, Kazarmila. So many, oh maker, there are so many. And if that sight in the hut was anything to go by, Finian's name would soon join that list as well. Percival's knees buckled, and he landed roughly in the mud, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. It was happening again. Maker, it burned. He could feel it eating him up inside. No one left, once again, no one was left. There would be no Duncan to whisk him away and give him a purpose this time. Because now Duncan was dead too. Percival. Alistair's voice was soft and uncertain, thick with a grief that Percival knew very well. The sound of footsteps approached him ponderously. It burst up in him then. Laughter, harsh and painful. This man, the one who had put a hand on his shoulder after the joining and pretty much told him he was imagining things, he now knew better, didn't he? Alistair didn't come any closer, and when Percy looked at him over his shoulder, he saw the other warden watching him with wide, broken eyes. Suddenly, he couldn't laugh anymore, and his pit emptied of everything but that low burning rage that was his constant companion. "I told you, didn't I?" Percy said, his voice sounding a great deal steadier than he felt. "I told you." Everyone I know dies. Stay away from me, or you'll be next. Percival. Like he was biting back tears. How dare he? Percival felt the rage coiling up inside him, wrapping around his heart. Don't you look at me like that. Like I'm your last connection to what you lost. He stumbled to his feet, whirling on the other warden. Alistair took a startled step back, but stayed silent. Don't you get it? They're dead. They're all dead, and you might as well lie down and die too, because you're going to follow them. Just like the rest of them. Just like everyone. There were tears in Percy's eyes now, a surprise, since he hadn't been able to dredge up enough feeling for tears for weeks. It was all fresh again, the pain of seeing his father, lying on the floor in his mother's arms. Of Oren's cut-up body. Mother Malol, friend and spiritual guide, pinned to the pulpit with a sword through her chest. Now the older images were mixed with new ones of cheerful, amiable Davith, dead and cold on the ground of Ostagar. Of Duncan, bidding them a safe battle as they started across the bridge toward the Tower of Ishal. Of Hugo, curled up in the kennel, trying to sleep off an illness that destroyed everything it touched. Of Finian lying so still, that wheezy little sound coming through his lips. Everyone he cared for died. Every single one. He spun away from Alistair, because he couldn't bear to look into those broken eyes anymore, such a mirror to his own now. Rage whirled through him, and raised his head to the clear spring sky and roared out his fury. Is this all part of your plan? Shall I befriend the archdemon too? Make nice with him? Then will you strike him down too? He threw out his hands, beseeching the Maker. Or is this some sort of punishment? Killing others to account for my sins, how is that fair? Whatever happened to our Maker sees this with a heavy heart. Or was Androsta just full of shite? Alistair was still standing behind him, far too silent and still looking at him like that. Percival spun back on the other man again, advancing a step with a canine snarl. You should have died with them. We should have died with them. He took another step, and the other man took a shaky step back. Doesn't it just burn, knowing that they gave their lives for you, and you're not the least bit worthy of it? He advanced more quickly, feeling around his person for a sword, a dagger, anything. That there is nothing you could ever do to make up for that sacrifice. He growled again, shoving Alistair up against the wall of the hut, and the other warden was still just looking at him. You want me to end it for you, Alistair? The pain? Because it doesn't go away. It never goes away. Or for the love of... A new voice rumbled, and Percy was suddenly yanked off Alistair by someone gripping his ponytail, snapping his head back. He growled furiously, his world going red, and he whirled on the attacker with a punch. Garrot caught the flying fist with his free hand and twisted it. Percival felt the pain as the maneuver strained his shoulder, but he didn't care. He needed to hurt something, because there was so much pain inside him that it could only overflow, if not at Alistair, fine. Garrot, then. Percival kicked out, his bare foot catching the dwarf across the recently reset nose. Garrot responded in kind by biting the leg. The dwarf was no stranger to dirty fighting, apparently. Again, Percival felt the pain, but it only added to his compulsion to make someone hurt. He grabbed Garrot's throat and squeezed, and the dwarf's jaws loosened enough for him to pull his leg out. Garrot grabbed his arms with both hands, yanking him forward so that they were eye level, Percival snarling into a pair of brown eyes that looked miffed. Then, Garrot swiftly drew back one hand and delivered an open-palmed slap across Percival's face that sent the noble reeling. His head ringing, he stumbled a step to the side before losing his balance and falling, his rage suddenly fleeing him as his head spun. For a minute, he lay face down in the mud, catching his breath and realizing what he'd just been trying to do. Oh mercy, oh Maker, what have I done? Nothing, yet. Garrot bent over him, studying him with a flat expression. Better now. He swallowed, and shame washed over him. I was trying to kill you. Yeah. Garrot arched an eyebrow. Not doing a very good job then, were ya? Percival turned his face into the dirt, ashamed. Oh Maker, what had come over him? He'd been a bit off lately, sure. But to try to kill an ally? One of the few allies he had left? The dwarf nudged his bare back pointedly with one leather boot, then started walking away. Get over it. Percival raised his head, watching the dwarf sit down in the shadow of the hut and resume sharpening his weapons. Apparently, he'd been sitting there doing so during Percy's entire scene. Percival's hands clenched in the dirt, and he felt that awful, destructive anger flicker, still inside him. It is not that easy. Garrot swiped his hand axe across his whetstone, dark eyes looking up to meet Percival's. Didn't say it was. Slowly, Percival nodded, then lay back down in the dirt, because he didn't trust himself to do anything else. 33 Lost and Found. Something heavy landed on the ground nearby, and a Dalish accent said, "This was all I could find." Khazar opened his eyes. He tried to turn his head at the sound of the voice, but doing so sent a fresh wave of agony from the vicinity of his collarbone. "Don't move," Felicity's voice said wearily above him. She sounded tired, and frustrated. Then, her voice rose. "Thank you, Mila. Were you able to find anything in the mage camp?" "I could not get that far in." "So it's completely overrun, then." So Marnan was nearby too. She also sounded tired. And sad. Khazar squinted, the world swimming in and out of focus. There was something green and splotchy above him. A tree. And beyond that, the bright, sunny sky. Hadn't it been raining? It felt like it had been raining. He was cold enough for it. "What about the Tower of Ishal, Mila?" Marnan's voice continued. She was somewhere to his right, but he couldn't see her, because it hurt to turn his head. All he could see was the stupid tree above him. "I attempted to scout it, but it, too, was overrun. It is impossible to say whether the other wardens would have gotten out in time." "They had to have," Marnan said tightly, though it was obvious she didn't believe that any more than Khazar did. His head was clearing a bit now, even if his eyes couldn't seem to focus right. They'd been in a battle, he remembered, and he'd been shot. Then they'd dragged him through the woods and, he couldn't really say what had happened after that. He remembered a lot of Felicity telling him to do things, and the burning pain of someone taking the arrow out of him, but everything else was pretty vague. A dark form appeared in his field of vision. Ah, there she was now, his overbearing know-it-all of a savior. Her hands were all gentle and caring for now, but he had no doubt that she'd turn stiff and self-righteous again the moment he did something she disapproved of. There was the soft pop of a cork being removed, and then Felicity's hand spread something wet across his forehead. Something that swiftly began to feel like ice, seeping through his skin and into his veins. What's the idea?" He stuttered hoarsely, every word stretching that arrow wound. He shivered in earnest now. "That's SS fucking sea cold. Khazar. Language. Yep, there it was. Like an annoying, bossy older sister. He's awake." The red hair of the dwarf warrior appeared in Khazar's vision on the side opposite from Felicity. He squinted, but couldn't seem to make out her face. His chattering teeth jarred the arrow wound, and he clamped both jaw and eyes shut with a groan. Ice coursed through him. "I'm sorry if it's uncomfortable, Khazar," Felicity said, not sounding very sorry at all. "But I need to lower your fever, and the only means I have of doing so at the moment is warmth bomb. I have a FF fever." Someone gently tucked covers tightly around his torso, though he couldn't say who, since his eyes were still closed. "For nearly 2 days. How are you feeling?" Marnan asked. "Sea cold." Felicity sighed. "Mila, have you had any luck finding help?" "There are no settlements within a distance that we can reasonably carry him," said the Dalish. There was a moment of silence, then Felicity reluctantly said, "Perhaps we should track down those apostates after all, then. I'd hate for my own concerns to endanger anyone's life. I have already attempted to do so." "You, what?" "But I said I didn't want you seeking them out." "And since when do you have the right to command me, Shemlin?" Khazar chuckled, opening his eyes and craning his head around just so he could see the glares they were giving one another. It hurt, but it was worth it. So much for them being the only ones who could tolerate one another. "It doesn't matter," Marnan interrupted tiredly. "The end is the same, Felicity, is it not?" Felicity harumphed, but capitulated. "I suppose. However, Mila continued, I'm afraid that I was unable to locate them, based on the instructions. Perhaps if you could be more specific, Durjan Len. Marnan laid her head in her hands. I cannot. These surface forests, the navigation of them is so unfamiliar to me, with no specific pathways or separate chambers. Without a guide, I get confused. I am sorry. Mila nodded. This is understandable. These mages are obviously quite skilled at hiding. I've found very little evidence of their presence here, and certainly nothing I can track. I do not doubt that this Morrigan led you about in circles while guiding you, merely so that you would have difficulty retracing the path later. Khazar squinted over at the other elf, and the question came out of him, unbidden. Is that something Dalish do? Mila looked at him coolly, but nonetheless nodded. On occasions when we have reason to accept a stranger into our camp, yes. Oh. A particularly harsh shudder jerked through him, jarring his wound. He closed his eyes again against the ensuing flash of pain. Fuck. There was a minute of silence while Khazar just shivered. Then. I am so sorry, Khazar, Marnan suddenly said harshly. All of you. This is all my fault. What? That was Felicity. Marnan, no. We've been over this. And I stand by my apology. It was my idea to try to flank. I agreed with Duncan to let the front lines face a potential blight horde. The guilt for this fiasco is mine. Marnan, that's not true. Felicity cried. It seems to me, Mila put in, that the greatest guilt here belongs to the man who did not answer the beacon as we did. If we are to be angry with anyone, let it be him. Now that, said a new voice, and all three women around him jumped, is the most sensible thing any of you has said all day. Mila's bow was out and drawn in a flash, an arrow aimed into the trees toward the voice. Who goes there? Show yourself. Mila, be at ease, Marnan said. That is Morrigan. 'Tis true, the witch said, stepping out of the shadow of a gnarled tree, I am certainly myself. And you, it seems, are lucky to be alive. Khazar squinted, having difficulty focusing. Felicity was still huddled over him, even while Marnan and Mila stepped forward to greet the new arrival. The witch looked exactly as wild and exactly as shirtless as she had been last time Khazar had seen her. Judging by the pink in the splotchy blur, that was all he could make out, anyway. How long have you been watching us? Mila said stonily. Touchy, are you? Worried that your infamous Dalish survival skills are failing you? How very quaint. Did you not recently say that I was, obviously quite skilled at hiding? Apparently, a while, Marnan said wryly to Mila. Then, she addressed Morrigan. Then you know of our plight. Yes, I am aware of the state of your fellow warden. At that, Khazar saw her cast a glance in his direction. He couldn't read her facial expression with how his vision swam, but her voice sounded unconcerned. That wasn't good. After a moment of silence, Marnan pressed, might you be able to help us? Perhaps. But why would I want to help you? What? You come into my woods twice now, always asking and never offering. You ask me to take this creature in for healing, yet you offer nothing in return. What would you ask? The dwarf said. Wealth? Power? Oh, but that is a question. The woman began circling around the camp, eyeing them each in turn like a prowling cat. What could I, a mage of some not insignificant skill, possibly want from you, and, let's be honest, soon to be 3 grey wardens wandering lost in the woods, with no order behind them and nothing of their own but ashes and rubble? What might I want from you? Why, the answer is simple then, is it not? I want nothing. Marnan's voice was confused. Then you will help us after all? No. Khazar said hoarsely. She's leaving me here to die. You make it sound needlessly malevolent, the witch said. I am merely leaving you as I found you. That I announced my presence at all is merely a matter of chance on your part. Marnan's axe came off her back. You could truly be that cruel. Cruel is a matter of opinion. Is it cruel for the wolf to strike at the weakest member of the herd, if it means feeding its young? Is it cruel for the spider to spin its web across the most likely path of the fly, when it would starve otherwise. No, Marnan said sternly, but it is wrong to leave a child to die when you are perfectly capable of doing something about it. Khazar squeaked a protest. Child. The witch began to speak again, but Felicity's voice interrupted her. Perhaps, there is something we can offer you. Morrigan, right? A wary nod. You're an apostate, correct? A mage trained outside the tower. If this precedes some sort of threat, mage, I will not be taken in by it. Not a threat. A trade. There was a moment of silence. I'm listening. Khazar and I were tower trained. Between us, we possess a wealth of knowledge that you may not have been privy to during your upbringing out here. Uses of healing, primal magic, spirit magic. Would it not be beneficial to supplement your current repertoire with somewhat more standardized knowledge? If only to get a fuller range of magical skills. The witch thought that over. And you offer to teach me these tower-taught skills. The pithy spells that your chantry approves of? You really think that a fair trade? Knowledge, Felicity said, quite firmly, is always a fair trade, because only by having it can you ensure that it is never used against you. The witch hummed thoughtfully. Then, quite suddenly, she said, very well. You'll help us. Felicity squealed with excitement. Provided you hold up your end of the bargain, yes. I will show you and your companions back to my mother. She will be able to care for your companion there. Thank you, Morrigan, Marnan said dutifully. Gratitude is hardly necessary. The woman turned and started off into the woods. 'Tis a trade, after all. Khazar found himself being shifted from the bedroll he was on onto a makeshift litter made of reeds and wolf skin. Ah, the usefulness of having a Dalish elf in the party. The transfer hurt, but he was just too tired, cold, and miserable to curse anyone out for it. Then, the litter was borne up, and he watched the tree canopies pass above him. Above that, solid and bright, was the clear spring sky. 34 wallowing blondes and big to-dos. It took 2 days for the elf to wake up. When he did, Garrod heard him hoarsely ask for water. Then, once given a sip, he slipped away again. It took another day of the elf wavering in and out before he showed any sort of coherence. And when he did, the blonde wreck spent a good half-hour weeping into his lap. The elf, of course, spent the entire time patting his back and whispering soothing words, and that was really only encouraging the man's wallowing, as far as Garrod was concerned. But what did he know? He was just some dumb duster, after all. The ex-Templar wasn't handling things much better, to be honest. He wasn't screaming at the clouds or trying to kick the crap out of his companions, but he had grown overly morose. Apparently, his defense mechanism, his sense of humor, had completely broken down under the weight of his personal tragedy. Pfft. Please. Garrod was hardly heartless, mind. He wasn't particularly happy that the boss was dead, of course not. And he'd miss some of the more entertaining wardens, like Emmett and Khazar. But you just had to adjust to their absence and move on with your life. He didn't understand why the topside-ears didn't get that. He chopped dexterously at the gourd now, feeling his frustration peak just at the thought of it all. They had a sodding job to do. It didn't matter that his boss was dead. Again, when Garrod Broska was given a job, he finished it. And his companions, the only other Grey Wardens within any reasonable distance, were starting to become a distraction. Not the entertaining kind, either. He glanced over his shoulder at them now. He was stationed in the hut's kitchen area, preparing dinner from what he could with the witch's strange stock. After living with humans for a month, Garrod was under the impression that these herbs and cuts of meat were strange, even by surface standards. Still, one couldn't go wrong with some old-fashioned roasted meat and vegetables. Thus, the gourd. And it was better than letting Percival try to cook, or ancestors forbid Alistair. He shuddered at the memory of that one time they'd let the ex-Templar cook dinner at Ostagar. No one would ever make that mistake again. The rest of the wardens were in the hut's bedroom area. Finian was, of course, still bedridden, although Flemeth indicated that he should be up and about in only a couple more days. The broken leg would likely not stand up to extended travel for another week or so, but that was still damn impressive as far as Garrod was concerned. He'd once seen a woman get her arm broken by an angry client. It had been swollen and useless for over a month afterward. Of course, she'd then died of whatever sickness the client had given her, but that wasn't the point. Finian seemed to be teaching Percival some sort of card game. It looked like a gambler's game to Garrot, the kind Birat used to rig. And it seemed it worked the same way up here on the surface. Every time coin changed hands between the two, it always passed from human to elf. The sneaky rascal was cheating, no doubt about that. Still, they both seemed to be having fun. Garrot even saw the blonde wretch crack a smile or two. Percival had been relatively docile since his breakdown a couple days earlier. He seemed to have better control of himself, anyway, though there was still the potential for something nasty. Garrot had resolved to keep an eye on him. If there was one thing they didn't need at this point, it was to have one of them cut down by the sword of their own comrade. Alistair sat on the other pallet, watching Garrot, of all things. Apparently just because he could. It made the dwarf sigh. Like he'd said, all this wallowing was distracting. Flemeth puttered around the kitchen near Garrot, mixing some sort of potion together out of various herbs and roots. He never bothered to ask her what she was up to. As something of a tinkerer himself, he found the greatest satisfaction in being able to work uninterrupted during the building process, thus saving all the payoff for when the item in question performed the way it was intended. This was the case whether it was a claw trap concocted out of old bits of armor, or an acid flask rigged to burst explosively when one threw it at an ogre. He assumed it was the same case for potions. Morrigan had been in and out in the last few days, but she rarely did more than offer cool remarks or be deliberately provocative in multiple meanings of the word. That morning, she'd quite deliberately trailed a hand up Percival's arm while asking insincerely about his fading injuries. After she'd left for her daily woodsy wandering, Percival had set to brooding something fierce. Finian had then pointed out that she was likely just uncomfortable with the strangers in her home and was trying to take control of the situation. After a bit of thought, Garrot had to admit that the elf was probably right. Finian was one manipulative son of a nug, but that certainly gave him a good eye for motivation. Sometimes, Garrot wondered what the elf saw when he looked at him. The hut door opened, and there was the witch now. "Mother, I'm home. And it seems I've been followed by a handful of strays. Welcome back, dear. Do be a good hostess and let them in." Garrot glanced back curiously, only to nearly drop the kitchen knife as a familiar dark-haired head poked through the door. Felicity. Percival was the first to react, leaping up and crossing the room in 2 long strides. He swooped down on the mage and wrapped her in a hug that was part enthusiasm and part relief. Percival. Alistair was equally dumbfounded. You're alive." Finian just smiled broadly and waved from his bed. "Great," Garrot grumbled, though he couldn't bite back his own smile at seeing the mage alive, obnoxious though she was. She'd healed his ass once or twice, after all. Now I gotta cut up more of these demmed gourds. You're all here." Felicity's smile grew as she extracted herself from Percival's embrace. "Alive? Oh, wonderful." She turned and shouted through the door. "Guys. Alistair and the others made it." Percival hurriedly opened the door, and Mila's tattooed head poked in, scanning the room. Meanwhile, Flemeth shooed Alistair off the pallet and began smoothing it out. "Lay him over here, dears." "One might think, Mother," Morrigan said acidly, crossing her arms under her bosom, "that you were expecting me to bring company." "Of course not, dear. Your will is your own, after all." That sly smile said entirely differently, and that made Garrot chuckle. Mila moved into the room, a litter behind her, borne on the other end by Marnan, son of a nug. Her too. Slung between them was Khazar, looking weak and pale, and rather miffed at life in general. Garrot laughed. "What is it with elves being so damned delicate?" At Mila's sharp look, he amended, "Well, elf men anyway." Finian, of course, had a smile and a retort for that. "It's because we're so handsome." The Maker felt the need to compensate somehow. This earned a snort from Khazar. The girls laid the mage on the pallet, and Flemeth retrieved some of her fresh brew and ladled it into a bowl. This, she brought over to Khazar. While she coaxed the elf to drink, Garrot turned and started digging through the cooking supplies. They genuinely did need more food, if all of them wanted to have dinner. Really, Flemeth could have warned him, at least. Oh, Finn. Garrod heard Felicity cry. What happened? He decided to take a ride in Ogre, that's what, Alistair said. Ah, so there was a bit of that humor again, though a bit more melancholy in tone than usual. Not recommended, Finian said lightly. Marnan chuckled. Well, I could have told you that. Going for the eyes, I take it. I dual-wield daggers. It was pretty much the only target I had available. I gotta say, funniest thing I've ever seen, Garrod put in, chuckling at the memory. He glanced back, noticing that the others had settled down into various positions around the hut. Morrigan, meanwhile, was sulking in a corner, glaring coldly. Yep, Elf had a point about her. The look on the ogre's face, when the elf just jumped up and latched on, like, what the stone is this little thing, and why is it stabbing my face? Priceless. And then, Finian said sheepishly, it decided to use me for sack ball practice. I was kind of tempting fate, on that one. Still, Percival put in, we couldn't have beat it without you. He could feel the shock run through the new arrivals at the sound of Percival's voice. Garrod just shrugged and started preparing the spit for the meat. He was now used to the advent of the man talking. They'd get used to it, too. Assuming the guy kept talking. It's true, Alistair said. If you hadn't blinded it, Percival and me would have just kept smacking at it until it got smart enough to just try to attack one of us at once. He paused. Lucky for us, ogres have very short attention spans. That drew some chuckles, though it was more the relieved kind of chuckling than the humor-elicited kind. How about you, Khazar? Finian asked. What happened? What does it look like? The mage said crossly. I got shot. Loghain quit the field, Marnan said, and the whole room darkened at the reminder. We were left with a horde of angry darkspawn and an incapacitated mage. So, we retreated. Morrigan chuckled. Is that another way of saying you ran away like little schoolgirls? Wisest decision I've even heard you make, Princess, Garrod countered. Honored to have your approval, Brand, she shot back. Whoa, whoa. Alistair broke in, looking between the two dwarves. Can we not do this right now? Please. Marnan sighed. You're right. I apologize. She met Garrod's eyes with determination. Garrod Braska, if you'll have it, I would like to declare a truce between us. At least until certain more pressing matters are dealt with. Garrod snorted. Leave it to the princess to make a big to-do about not biting one another's heads off. Still, he agreed with the sentiment. It made a lot more sense than the topside ears he'd been coping with recently. Maybe the dwarves did have something in common. I'm game if you are. Marnan. Judging by the look in her eye, she was very aware of the lack of surname, and not a little surprised by it. He just smirked and turned back to his cooking. I, too, would like to, what was it? Declare a truce. Felicity said. She turned pointedly toward Khazar, who was squinting up at her with narrowed eyes. Khazar, I apologize for what happened at the tower. It was none of my business, and I never would have wished, what almost happened, upon you. That piqued Garrot's curiosity. There were lots of things left unsaid in that sentence. I do not expect you to forgive me, or even like me. But I would like it if we could work together, as colleagues, and mutually endeavor to stop the blight. Khazar looked at her suspiciously for a minute from the pallet. Then, he rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. Whatever. Still, even a lukewarm response was a win, with him. And judging by the smile on Felicity's face, she knew it. I, too, would like to apologize, if we're airing things, Percival said, and all eyes turned to him. The blond man had taken up a position by one window, leaning back against the sill. When he spoke, it was in a soft, cultured tone, with none of the growls and clipped tones that Garrod had assumed were customary for him. Percival's gaze flitted from warden to warden. These past weeks, I've been rather indisposed. Truth be told, some fairly painful events unfolded shortly before Duncan recruited me. I'm still not ready to speak of it. I don't know that I ever will be. He drifted off for a moment, but then shook his head to clear it. The point is, I've said some things I regret, and done some things I'm not proud of. At that one, Garrot was included in the gaze. The duster shrugged it off. I haven't been able to put my heart into the fight, and for that I apologize. In that case, Marnan said with a diplomatic smile, we are glad to have you join us at last. It is nice to meet you, Percival. He smiled. It was thin and still had some of that pain in it, but Garrot definitely found it much more tolerable than any of his other expressions. My friends call me Percy. He then did a strange hesitation, his mouth opening and shutting once. Then, he took a deep breath and swept a courtly bow, Percy Cowsland. A pleasure to meet you all. Felicity gasped, eyes going wide and hand going over her mouth. Alistair, who had been tipping back on a stool, suddenly fell backwards with a crash. Finian hid sniggers behind his hand. Everyone else, including Garrot, looked around, confused by the reactions. Cowsland. Felicity sputtered. As in Terran Cowsland. For some reason, the blond man winced. Ah, a noble. That might explain it. Well, it seemed the princess wasn't in solitary company. Finian smiled at Percival, though there was something set in his eyes. You know, Davith once told me that from the moment he met you, he knew you were a noble. He called it a quality. Did he? Percival matched the elf's expression. Yeah. Finian sat back on the pillows, sighing wistfully. I never did get him to teach me how to sense it. It would have come in handy. You'll have to detect nobles the old-fashioned way, then. How's that? Look for the upturned nose and contemptuous smirk. No. Walk up and ask a man the time of day. If he then kidnaps your cousin for your impertinence, he's a noble. Finian fell back against the covers and roared with laughter. Garrot sensed a story there, but it was obvious no one else was privy to it. Everyone was still too dumbfounded with the revelation that Percival had just told a joke more than the fact that he was a nobleman, even. Garrot smiled and set the meat to cooking over the fire. Percival, it seemed, wasn't going to be too much of a burden after all. Now, they just had to worry about Alistair. Speaking of whom? Well, this is all quite touching, isn't it? The man carefully picked himself up again after his tumble. While we're at it, does anyone else want to submit any apologies? Say, for being a little bit difficult. Why do you look at me as you say that, Shemlin? And don't you dare turn that look on me, Templar. A sigh. Right, never mind. Moment over, I guess. Garrot wasn't the only one to chuckle. 35 unsettled. Mila was not nervous. 2 days ago, they'd come upon a packed road. It was heavy with foot traffic, wagons, and pack animals. Such groups passed theirs once every couple hours, laden with children, the elderly, and all the earthly possessions some of the travelers seemed to have. All the while, the party passed farms and homesteads, every one of them abandoned. Lothering was the apparent destination of all these humans, just as it was for the wardens. Lothering. A Shemlin settlement made of stone and wood. Stationary. Brimming with the people who had enslaved hers for 1,000 years. And she would face it with Shemlin, 2 Durgan Len, and a couple of flat ears. She was most certainly, most definitively, most obstinately not nervous. The wardens had been traveling for over a week now, when the journey should have taken only a couple days. However, Finian had been unable to walk for most of that time, and Khazar was still getting his stamina back after his illness. Or perhaps the mage had never been particularly hardy to begin with, Mila really couldn't say. Now, at the least, Finian was capable of walking, instead of alternating between hitching rides on the backs of Percival or Alistair, albeit not very fast and only with the aid of a walking stick. Morrigan had been most cross about the elf using her magic staff to help him walk, but he had nonetheless somehow gleaned her permission out of her, as was his knack. Mila was beginning to pick up on little things like that, after having spent time with these outsiders. It came as a surprise to her at first, though she now knew it shouldn't have, to find that each of her companions was just as prone to subtle differences and idiosyncrasies as any Dalish elf. Felicity Amel, for example, had a heavy book in her bag. Mila had not initially understood the mage's compulsion to carry such a thing around, as it was heavy and the bearing of it obviously exhausted her. Then, after their flight from Ostagar, Mila had watched as the healer spent a frazzled day caring after the injured flat ear. That night, the healer had pulled out the book and started reading it and writing in it. Mila had watched as the human had settled right back down, obviously soothed by the process. Felicity was a keeper, or as close to one as the Shemlin could come. She kept the knowledge of her people, and was constantly seeking to expand it. This was something the other wardens obviously did not understand, with how they teased her about bedtime stories and diaries, but Mila understood. Mila found it respectable. A strange thought, concerning a human, but humans, as a whole, were strange. Like Alistair. All the time Mila had been in Ostagar, Alistair had been the one to try to take control, telling her to stay in camp and whatnot. But only now, as she watched the way he deferred to others, did she realize how very reluctant he had been to perform such a task. He was the most senior of their numbers, but seniority held no importance for him. It was all very strange. And yet, it was these various oddities that made it easier for Mila to see the people underneath each face. Perhaps she had judged too harshly, initially. Even if their people had enslaved hers for 1,000 years. Since stepping out on the packed road, Mila had given up her position at the front of the group to Marnan. The huntress much preferred to walk parallel to them off the road, she just preferred the feel of turf under her feet over packed dirt. As such, when they stopped moving, she could not tell why right away. Only by peeking out of the trees did she see the cluster of figures up ahead, in front of what appeared to be overturned wagons sprawled across the road. Oh! Alistair could be heard whispering as a trio of figures stepped forward to meet them. Highwaymen. Preying on refugees, I'd bet. Mila slipped back to the treeline, unslinging her bow. When she saw Garrot slip away, she hoped it was to do the same. Ho, they're travelers. The cheerful human in front called. Mila was all too aware of other humans approaching them stealthily through the trees, and she slid between a pair of twin trunks so as not to be detected. So good to see new faces. And led by a dwarf, of all things. I am hardly a thing, sir, Marnan said, openly putting her hand on her axe handle. The human on the right said. They don't look much like them others. Maybe we should just let these ones pass. Nonsense. The leader cried, cheerfully turning to Marnan. Wonderful day, is it not? A simple 10 silvers, and you're free to move on and enjoy it. Or we could roast you on a spit for free, grumbled Khazar. No need for any of that, Finian said, limping his way up through the other wardens so that he stood next to Marnan. He made an unimpressive figure, wearing that friendly smile and leaning heavily on the twisted piece of wood Morrigan used as a staff. I'm sure we can come to a peaceful agreement, here. Ah, yes, see. The highwayman leader crowed. What a smart elf you have here, indeed. It's a pretty nice setup you have going here. Finian continued, waving at the overturned carts. The carts blocking most of the road are a nice touch, though a little obvious. Well, we certainly appreciate the compliments. You have a bit of experience with such things. Finian chuckled. Oh, you might say so, and not usually from this side. He winked conspiringly and lowered his voice as if to impart a great secret. As your friend noticed, we're not refugees. Well, even non-refugees have to pay the toll. All in good time, my friend. Finn hobbled forward and put a hand to the highwayman's back, leading him back toward the broken carts. But the thing is, I noticed some things about your operation that you could do a bit better on. First of all, 10 silvers is way too low for marks as obviously capable as us. Maker's breath, Alistair could be heard whispering as they moved to follow. Mila silently paralleled them, flitting from hiding spot to hiding spot. He's not bartering them up, is he? Just let the elf do his thing, Percy whispered back. Well, I can hardly set the cost any higher, the highwayman said. Refugees don't tend to have much more than that. To ask more would provoke them to fight, and we don't really need the pointless bloodshed. True, but that's not the point, Finian said breezily. You didn't evaluate your mark. You should have scouts out ahead of the ambush point, to let you know about unusual circumstances. Case in point, you haven't even noticed that 2 of my men have disappeared. Wait, what's that? The highwayman turned to peer back at the group. Yeah, said the second highwayman. Weren't there another dwarf, or something with them? Good eye. Finn crowed, slapping said highwayman on the back. This one's a keeper, good sir. If you had more men, where? Oh, they're around. It probably won't be important. Finian grinned toothily, but even Mila could detect the threat in the cheerful words. She kept still among the trees. She could hear one of the bandits hiding near her whisper to another one. They were close by indeed. Now, Finian continued, after allowing just enough time for that to sink in, were this my ambush, I'd put archers behind the carts, and maybe even get a mage, for if the marks get frisky. Though those get expensive, and be careful of the blood mages. Oh man, does that get messy. Finian stepped back from the highwayman and let out a wistful sigh that, had Mila not known better, she would have sworn was genuine. Ah, I miss it sometimes. Not the blood mages, of course. But the thrill of the trap. The camaraderie of the gang. And, of course, the weight of the sovereigns in one's pocket. Though. He looked around thoughtfully. I don't suppose you get much coin out here. Alas, no. The highwayman also sighed. At least the picking's easy. Well, as easy as picking off the living gets, anyway. The highwayman's curiosity was piqued. What do you mean by that, friend? Finian laughed, waving at the team behind him. Where do you think we just got all our nice things? The dead. Ostagar, man. Said the second. We heard that's full of dark spawn. If it's full of dark spawn, how did we get all this stuff? Finian winked. We certainly didn't walk up and ask nicely. No, there's an entire ruin down there, full of abandoned army camps. The king himself left some stuff down there, not to mention several noble houses, and you're here picking off refugees? Heh, good luck with that. Will you excuse me for a moment? The highwayman turned and conversed quietly with his 2 companions, and Mila felt the men in the trees near her shifting nervously. The wardens, meanwhile, all stayed silent, seemingly reluctant to break the spell. Mila looked over them from her position. Most seemed to be staring at Finian in shock, though she noted that Percival merely had the look of someone who was waiting for something. She had noted that the Shemlin noble and the Flat Ear had something of a camaraderie between them that went a bit further than most of the others, possibly crafted before Duncan had brought them to Ostagar. The fact that a human could be so casually friendly with an elf intrigued her, though it was obvious to her that the human did not regard them as equals, even if he himself wasn't aware of it. And she wondered whether the elf didn't perhaps think of them as more than mere comrades, but she was certainly imagining that. Then, the highwayman turned back around, and his 2 fellows ran back to the carts to start gathering everything. Well, now, friend. You've given me much to think about. And Ostagar's just down the way, you say? Why, I do grow a bit bored of this old trick myself. Perhaps a change of scenery would do the men some good, eh? Get the blood flowing. That's the spirit, Finian agreed enthusiastically. Oh, and of course. Your 10 silvers. Finian flipped a coin through the air between them, which confused Mila. Had he not been doing this in the first place to avoid that very thing? Much obliged, friend. With that, the highwayman started off, loading up one of the carts and heading south. Mila waited in perfect stillness as shadows moved around her, the potential ambushers now following their leader southward. The wardens all stayed still and silent while the highwayman passed. Then, only when they were safely out of earshot, did the beaver dam break. What was that? Alistair sputtered. I don't get it, Khazar said. What was with the ruse, if you just paid him in the end anyway? Finian grinned, holding up 2 heavy purses he hadn't had a moment before. What, you think I paid with my own money? Marnan, however, regarded Finian grimly. You realize, do you not, that you just sent those men to their own deaths? Finian's grin faded. Yeah. I do. He paused while he tied the purses onto his belt. The way I figure it, their deaths would have been just as certain if we'd fought them. Now, it's their choice. In the end, they're willing to risk the danger for a little loot. I just nudged them in the direction. By lying to them. Finian shrugged. I was also pretending to be another highwayman. Only an idiot trusts a highwayman. And a pickpocket, apparently, Marnan said. Then, she walked purposefully past Finian, done acknowledging him. The look on Finian's face was crestfallen. As they started forward, once again heading toward town, Morrigan said disdainfully, I fail to see why we did not simply kill them. Mila left the trees as the road rose up on an old Tevinter stone highway. She followed some steps behind the rest of the group as they traveled. No, killing, Percival muttered. No more than necessary. There's been enough of that already. Why? Have you not the stomach for it? Why must you make not wanting to go on a murderous rampage sound like a weakness? Percival hissed darkly. My, but that did come to mind quickly despite the fact I never mentioned any such thing. Your quick protestation doth give thee away. Mila heard it all from outside the fray, as she usually did. It was keeping her vision clearer, perhaps, than that of her companions, to be afforded the outsider's perspective. Then again, there was perhaps something to be said about always being the one looking in. It grew wearying, sometimes, keeping up her stoic defenses against her companions' encroachments. She had to remain pure, to maintain her independence from the quicklings' matters, so that she would never be forced into a position where she must rely on them for anything. Becoming dependent on an outsider was as good as submission, and submission was a betrayal of the Dalish. Still, it grew tiring, keeping her mental bowstring constantly pulled so taut. After some minutes of walking, the trees thinned and gave way to campsites. These were not the robust, homestead campsites of the Dalish, nor the tidy, functional camps of the Ostagar armies. These camps were scattered and disorganized, and heaped with crates and knickknacks in equal measure. Beyond these camps, down the road and behind a low wall, was a village. Or at least, Mila supposed it must be a village. The squat, stone structures were similar enough to the various ruins she'd seen, including Ostagar. However, these weren't inhabited by undead or human armies, but by Shemlin civilians. And so many Shemlin civilians. The place was swarming with them. Mila stopped at the crest where the road turned downwards and wound through the campsites. Something about the sight of the town unsettled her, and it took her a moment to realize what it was. There were children here. This was no army camp, full of human fighters like those who had marched upon her people. These were the innocent, and the frail, and the frightened fleeing their homes as best they could when their homes could not flee with them. They would see her for what she was, and hate her or fear her, and she could not rightfully take up arms against them. Not against civilians. It left her at a loss for how to face these people. It was a sensation she did not appreciate. Well, Alistair's voice said up ahead, here we are. Lothering. It's like someone poked up a nest of spiders, Garrod observed. They're everywhere, aren't they? Look at all these refugees, Felicity said. They can't think this is a safe place to stop. We're planning on stopping here, Khazar pointed out flatly. Yes, but we have big swords and the ability to sense darkspawn creeping around, Alistair replied. They don't quite have the same luxury. And we wouldn't be stopping, Marnan said, if we didn't need someplace stable for you and Finian to finish healing. I'm fine, the mage snapped. I, however, Finian said softly, would appreciate the rest. He was still eyeing Marnan apprehensively, and she was still not acknowledging his presence. We'll need to figure out what we're going to do before proceeding anyway, Felicity said. After all, stopping the blight will certainly not be as simple as walking up to the archdemon and stabbing him in the eye. The chance to study our resources and plan accordingly would not go amiss. You're talking about the treaties? Garrod asked. In part. Like I said, this is the sort of thing that requires consideration of all possible goals and the most efficient routes to said goals. By the void, Khazar groaned. You're going to make this into a blasted homework assignment, aren't you? I thought I left that behind when I was recruited into an order designed to kill the living crap out of things. Think of it as a learning experience, Alistair said cheekily, obviously enjoying Khazar's unhappiness. I don't want to learn. I want to set things on fire. That requires no additional learning. They had started toward the town, still arguing. Mila, however, found that she was rooted on the top of the slope. She was left staring over the settlement, her stomach in her mouth. You all right? That was Percival, strangely enough. The man had been in the back of the group, as seemed to be his habit, and was thus the only one to notice her hesitation. The thought crossed her mind to question why he cared, but she snuffed it before it was given voice. Instead, she confessed, I am nervous. The human's face showed his confusion, and he tried to follow her gaze. Of what? The town. His confusion made her regret the slip. You would not understand, Shemlin. He looked back at her. No, I suspect not. Still, if you must wander into the wolves' den, at least you have others to shield your back. The silent assurance under the words surprised her. It was a promise that, should anything happen, the other wardens would stand by her. Viradalin. Together they were stronger than one. Mila found herself nodding speculatively and followed Percival as he started down the path. Indeed, she was learning many surprising things about her companions. Now she could only hope that the rest of the humans in this lothering felt the same. 36 The Chantry Sister. What do you mean there's no room? Inn's full. Chantry's full. Every house has more boarders than floorboards. The Templar looked over the group, then turned back to Marnan. If you want to set up camp outside with the others, no one's going to stop you. But you'd be far better just moving on. Marnan could not stifle a pang of annoyance at such an inconvenient twist, but it was hardly the Templar's fault. As far as she could tell, the man was doing the best he could. Who is in charge here? She asked. No one, really, since the ban went north with his men. The revered mother and the Templar captain, Sir Bryant, are doing their best to make up for the absence, but... May we speak with them? He shrugged. Sure, if you wish. Won't get you any place to sleep, though. Thank you, sir, she said with a sigh. As the Templar nodded and walked off, Marnan glanced behind her. They were in the village proper now, having just come in through the campsites when the Templar had greeted them. Alistair stood at her right shoulder, with the others trailing behind. Marnan felt a fresh pang of rage as her eyes flicked past Finian. That she still couldn't believe that seemingly friendly, gentle Finian Tabri had just convinced a group of men to walk to their own deaths. But she supposed that was the way of it. She'd grown up in a nest of vipers, and the ones with the most dangerous poisons were often the ones who could convince you they weren't poisonous at all. Belen came to mind. He'd always been her ally, she'd thought, always good for a bit of support when Trian got too uppity. He'd been able to smooth over with a smile and a few words any commotion caused among the nobles regarding Marnan's frequent trips out with the warriors. He had been a welcome island of sanity among the hair-pulling madness of the Diamond Quarter. Then, he had betrayed both her and Trian, all while wearing that charismatic smile. Finian was perhaps a different species from her brother, but a poisonous snake was still a poisonous snake. She was ashamed that she had been fooled by the act. And the fact that he still held consternation in his eyes as he watched her, she would be a fool to believe any expression he put on his face from now on. To people like him, everything was a mask. The chantry is right there, Alistair said, nodding toward a large building up ahead. Shall we? You're kidding, right? Khazar's voice snapped. He was glaring at Alistair, arms crossed and eyes narrowed in a posture Marnan had long since attributed to an imminent rise in his temper. I'm not going in there. It's bad enough that the Templars have taken over the town. They had to, Khazar, Felicity reasoned. With the band's forces gone, no one else is around to impose order. So they need Templars to lay down the law. He scoffed. Whatever, as long as they don't bother me. But that doesn't mean I'm walking in there and offering my head on a platter for them. He turned and started off. Good idea, kid, Garrot said, making the elf pause before he could get too far. I think I see a tavern across the stream, and it's been way too long since I had a drink. Anyone wanna join? Finian cast one more glance at Marnan, then smiled tiredly at the duster. I could use a seat. And I, Morgan said, could use my staff back. Thus, I must accompany you to this establishment, lest you squirrel it away. I wish to see the chantry, Felicity said suddenly. Outside the Tower of Magi, the chantry scholars keep the best archives in Ferelden. I've never had a chance to peruse a chantry library. Marnan nodded her approval. Very well. We will see if we can't speak with this, revered mother. She was still uncomfortable with the nuances of surface religion. Then, we will meet you there. She started toward the chantry. Alistair fell into step behind her, but he did call out to the other group. Finian, see if you can't use those weird mind control powers of yours for good and get us a couple in rooms. I'm so sick of sleeping in a tent. I'll see what I can do, the elf joked, and Marnan's hackles rose. Though I have to warn you, the laws of nature are a bit outside my power, as of yet. You'll just have to keep working on it, then. Marnan marched resolutely toward the chantry, and only looked back when they reached the entrance into the courtyard. Alistair paused in following her, looking startled by the glare she leveled at him. Coming behind him were Felicity and, farther back, Percival. Everyone else had turned and was heading across the river toward the inn. What? Alistair said, looking confused. I can't believe you're encouraging him. She spoke sternly, but softly enough that her voice wouldn't carry across the square. Who, Finn? Wait, you're actually really upset about the highwaymen, aren't you? Aren't you? Felicity broke in thoughtfully, he did make a good point on the road, Marnan. If we'd fought them, their deaths would be assured. Now, they have a chance of survival, though slight, as well as a chance to change their minds. At least a fight, Marnan growled, would have been honest. She whirled on her heel and stomped the rest of the way to the chantry. After a moment, she heard the others following. However, when she pushed through the doors, only Alistair and Felicity came in with her. Percival stopped at the threshold and, for a long moment, stared up at the front of the chapel with blank eyes. I have to go. He all but fled, leaving the three of them wondering. Alistair seemed to be biting his lip. Alistair, Marnan said, breaking the silence that had ensued. How might we recognize the revered mother? Oh, trust me. We'll know her when we see her. Alistair turned and led the way into the chapel, and Marnan took the time to study the religious space. Felicity did the same. The chantry would usually have been grand, in its own way. It had high, arched ceilings, and plentiful decorative columns and carvings. It was built out of solid stone, which Marnan was dwarf enough to appreciate, though she'd never really held much interest in building things herself. Now, however, most of the floor space was packed with bedrolls and supplies. People idled near the edges of the room, seeming to have nothing to do but stand about and pray to their maker. The wardens passed refugees and priestesses alike, and turned a corner. And there she is. Alistair waved a hand, indicating an older woman who was sitting in an alcove, her head bowed with exhaustion. Marnan couldn't help but pity the burden she must bear, trying to keep control over such a chaotic town. Standing over her was a man in Templar armor, though he had his helmet tucked under one arm. He, too, looked tired, and he spoke to her in a soft, wearied tone. From what snippets drifted toward them, it was a report regarding the local availability of food stores. Marnan approached the pair with respect. She may not have followed the chantry, but people who would do so much for so many deserved what honor she could afford them. The man stopped speaking as they approached, and they both turned to the wardens with expectant expressions, though their eyes weren't unkind. I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Marnan. Are you the revered mother? Yes, I am. Can I help you with anything? We are Grey Wardens in need of assistance. We were wondering if there were any help you could offer. Oh. Oh dear. She looked up at the Templar, who now bore a worried expression. Grey Wardens, he said. There is a bounty on any information pertaining to your whereabouts, and a higher one for your heads. You must know this. Alistair's spluttered "What?" echoed through the chapel, and Felicity frantically shushed him. Marnan decided it best to lower her voice. No, we did not. Who issued such a bounty? Tairn Loghain, the Templar said. That son of a dash. Alistair, hush. I am sorry to be the one to deliver such news. The Templar bowed his head in greeting. I am Ser Bryant, the captain of the Lothering Templars. Rest assured, I do not believe the reports, so you will not be harassed by any of my men while you are here. Marnan could hear Alistair and Felicity holding a furious, whispered conversation behind her. What reports might those be, precisely? The report handed down from Denerim is that the Grey Wardens betrayed the king at Ostagar, and left him on the field to die. That's a lie. Alistair roared. Loghain betrayed the king. Most of our order died fighting by the king's side, while he walked away. I find that almost as hard to believe, Ser Bryant said uncertainly. You put us in a difficult position, the revered mother broke in. We cannot be seen to aid you, you must know this. All I can promise is that we will keep your presence here a secret. Then that is all we will ask, Marnan said, even as she heard a protest raised behind her. Thank you. I apologize, Grey Wardens. Good luck to you. Disappointed, Marnan turned and led her companions away from the alcove. However, they'd barely left earshot when a chantry sister slipped smoothly out from behind a bookcase to meet them, making no attempt to hide the fact that she had been eavesdropping. She smiled brightly and smoothed a strand of short red hair behind her ear. You are Grey Wardens, yes. Marnan was surprised to hear that her accent wasn't Fereldan, but rather Orlshian. Standing on the border between the two countries as Orzammer did, Marnan was well familiar with the current charged relationship between the two nations. At least, the theory of it, from what trickled in through traders. So you heard that, did you? Alistair said, half sarcastic and half sheepish. Felicity's hand on his arm seemed to have calmed him, at least. I am Leliana. You said you were looking for help against the Darkspawn. That's why I am coming with you. Marnan was both amused and taken aback by the girl's boldness. I'm sorry, but our path will be very dangerous. I can fight, she interrupted, not missing a beat. I have daggers, and I'm a good shot with a bow. And I have picked up other skills in traveling that might be of use to you. Where would a chantry lay sister learn how to shoot a bow? Felicity wondered sincerely. I was not always a sister. Please, I will not be a burden, I promise. Not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but... Alistair said, why would you want to join us? The Maker wants me to go with you, Leliana said with confidence. He sent me a dream. Oh, is that all? Felicity appeared confused. But Chantry canon dictates that the only one the Maker has ever spoken to directly is Androsta. Particularly since her death. I haven't read any accounts of such holy visions. What I saw was real, Leliana pressed. I know it was. The Maker needs me to help you in this troubled time. Right, Alistair grumbled. And I'm the king of Ferelden. And this dwarf here? She's a magical dwarf, who spits candy and swings an axe forged from wishes and starlight. For all you know, Alistair, Marnan said, that may be true. Then, she turned back to the priestess, studying her. Beneath the chantry robe, the human was certainly fit enough, better than some of the priestesses she had glimpsed at Ostagar, anyway. Marnan was inclined to believe the Orlshian when she said she had combat experience. Then again, the dwarf's faith in her own ability to judge people had been very recently shaken. Thus, Marnan did what any great leader did when necessity dictated it, she deferred. Felicity, what are your thoughts? Felicity looked startled at being addressed. Then, she said, well, we certainly do need all the help we can get, and having someone with an association with the Chantry could hardly go amiss. If we are indeed to be hunted, we will need all the potential allies we can scrounge up, particularly if they have access to connections the rest of us do not. Leliana was nodding along thoughtfully, Marnan noted. With that in mind, we do intend to stay here for several days, although, come to think of it, that may prove quite risky, if we've a bounty on our heads. Then again, I can't imagine Finian could travel much farther without a break. I do need to tend to, oh, I'm digressing, aren't I? Regardless, if we are staying for a time, we hardly need to come to a decision immediately. Thus, We can test out Lelyana's skills with your permission, of course, Lelyana, in order to confirm that they will, indeed, prove beneficial to us. Such a trial period will also allow Alistair to come to a decision about whether or not she is as mad as he obviously believes she is. Alistair cracked a smile at that one. Picked up on that, did you? Felicity returned the expression. I dare say Khazar could have picked up on it, and his grasp of subtlety equates to freezing things so that they shatter instead of making them explode in a blinding ball of fire. Healing magic and insulting Khazar? You are the best mage ever. Marnan did not miss the flush that came to Felicity's cheeks at that, and she made a mental note to keep an eye on that situation. Even so, she turned back to Lelyana, who watched the exchange with an amused smile on her face. Very well, Lelyana. Will you consent to a trial period while we stay in Lothering? Of course I will. Oh, you won't regret it. Please, see that we don't. Even so, Marnan smiled, feeling optimistic for the first time since setting foot in this town. 37 A good old-fashioned tavern brawl. Finian jumped as a tray laden with tankards landed heavily on the table in front of him. Garrot was settling into the seat across from his. The bad news. The dwarf said. There's a blight coming, no one can afford any food, and there's still no free rooms in the inn. The good news? There's still booze. Finian chuckled, and stopped rubbing his sore leg to lift one tankard in toast. To there always being booze. Garrot grinned wryly and tapped his drink against Finn's. Both took a gulp, and Finn immediately coughed, then laughed. Yep, Garrot said, wiping his mouth. Awful swill. Makes me a little homesick, actually. The mages both eyed the tray dubiously. Morrigan took a sniff of the air and wrinkled her nose disdainfully. Khazar, however, experimentally picked up one of the other tankards and studied it as one would a piece of jewelry of questionable authenticity. The mage sipped it, and then jerked away as if burned and started spitting. Demon's teeth. People willingly drink this. Garrot and Finian both laughed. Through a clever combination of intimidation, smooth talking, and Morrigan transforming into a rat and nipping at some toes, mostly the last one, the group had managed to commandeer a table in the Dane's refuge. It was along the wall under the balcony, making it crowded as well as small. There was enough room for one person on each side, which made it awkward, considering there were 6 of them. Mila had showed no interest in the table, fortunately. She leaned against the nearby wall, stiff as a tree as her eyes darted around the room. Morrigan and Khazar milled next to the table, whispering to one another what were most likely snide comments on both their parts about the other customers in the tavern. The refuge was as packed as the rest of the village. Most tables were crowded with ragged refugees who were fortunate enough to be able to afford a table, though Finn did spot a couple armed figures, some priests, and even what appeared to be a Templar conversing with a knight. At Khazar's exclamation, Percival roused, raising his head off the tabletop. He'd slunk into the tavern about 2 minutes after the rest of them, wordlessly slumping into the seat next to Finian. Now, he picked up a tankard and downed it all in a couple long gulps. Only as he set the empty tankard back down did he make a face in reaction. That is, truly awful. My cousin, Shiani, says that with drinks like this, getting drunk is a reward for getting it down. Garrot leaned back in his chair and arched a brow. This cousin get kidnapped. Finian laughed and went in for another sip. Actually, yes. Ah. I'd wondered. Drinks that aren't mostly dregs taste better, Percival informed Khazar, who was glaring at his tankard as if it had insulted him. The best is a good wine. Something with a bit of sweetness, or, even better, spice, and a kick, but still subtle. His eyes went distant, and he fidgeted with his empty mug. I used to help Fergus my brother sneak bottles up from the wine cellar, back when he was courting his wife. Oriana was Antivan and therefore foreign, so, of course, father didn't approve. So Fergus made me, the baby brother of 12, his accomplice, and favored me with a sip of what I'd brought as a reward. Percival twirled the tankard, smiling sadly. He got me rather addicted to the stuff, I'm afraid. From those days on, I associated wine with illicit romantic entanglements, much to my father's simultaneous chagrin and amusement down the road. It was more than Finian was used to hearing Percival say about the past. The pickpocket wondered if the noble even knew he was speaking aloud. "I take it you must have had your own share of such entanglements, then," Morrigan said with an arched eyebrow. Finian sipped his mug, hiding a twinge of far more interest in Percy's answer than he really ought to have. Percival chuckled darkly, setting the tankard down. "Let us just say that the Cowsland Castle wine cellar now has more blank spots than not." Then, any mirth dropped off his face, and he growled. "That is, if he hasn't made off with the entire stores by now." The others looked on quizzically, but Finian had an idea of who Percival was referring. When they'd met King Callan, Percy had spoken of an Arlhow who had betrayed his family, and he'd injected such hatred and rage into that name that Finian felt an empathetic spark of anger for his sake. Now, seeing the anger and grief churning in the noble's eyes, Finn reached over and patted his shoulder. "Well, well, well. What have we here?" A low voice said nearby, and the wardens looked up to see two armored men approaching their table. The other one sneered, "It looks like an armored elf, a shady-looking dwarf, and a man with a high-ever shield on his back. Looks like we just need the man with the Templar shield and vacant eyes, and we'll have the complete set." Finian noticed the way their hands hovered over their weapons. "Oh boy. Whoa, wait a second," Finian said, and they glanced down at him with the casual contempt many humans reserved for elves. "That would make this harder. Sirs, sorry if we've offended, but is there a problem here?" "I'd say there's a problem," the second man snapped. "You're Grey Wardens." "The exact Grey Wardens Tairn Loghain appointed us to watch the roads for." "You have a problem with Grey Wardens?" Khazar snapped, eyes narrowing. "You lured the king into a trap to die," the first man growled in a low bass. "You betrayed him, and now—" "What?" Percival roared, leaping to his feet. "How dare you accuse us of betraying Callan? The real traitor is Loghain. We were there. We saw what happened. Then you are obviously blind. Or what else do you call quitting the field when the king was depending on his reinforcements?" Loghain recognized the trap for what it was. "If he had sent us in, we would have all died too. Or we would have won, and the blight would be over, instead of coming through the wilds, nipping at our heels." The rest of the tavern had gone deathly silent but for the standoff between the two. Even the minstrels on the second level had stopped playing. "Percy!" Finian hissed, trying to get his friend's attention. But the human was out of his reach, and his leg throbbed too much for Finn to be able to stand and approach either man. "You don't deny you're Grey Wardens, then," the second man said. He started to draw his mace, but Mila was then behind him, pressing her hunting knife against the back of his neck. "We are all Grey Wardens," she said coldly. "And the human speaks true. We did not betray your king." "I've have enough of these lies," cried the first of Loghain's men. "Kill them all." With that, there was the hiss of steel as two tables on opposite sides of the tavern, with 3 armored men apiece, rose to their feet and armed themselves. Percival whipped his shield from his back and pulled out his long sword with a feral growl, and Finian saw Mila duck under a mace blow from the man she had been menacing. Finian tried to stand up, but his leg throbbed sharply as soon as it touched the floor, and Morrigan had already taken up her staff, his makeshift walking stick, to wield it against one of the approaching trios. He hissed in pain, then noticed the fire crawling up Khazar's arms. The mage looked at the trio Morrigan wasn't attacking with a smirk of anticipation. No collateral damage, Finian thought it prudent to warn the other elf. Khazar glanced sidelong at him with some annoyance. "But dash. No collateral damage. This is the only eating establishment in town. Do you want to live off hardtack even here?" Khazar growled, but nonetheless dispelled the fire in his hands. Instead, he swept his hands forward, conjuring a sheet of ice across the ground that crawled up the enemy's legs, freezing them in place. Garrot emerged from the shadows underneath a table behind them, and promptly smacked one in the back of the neck with his hand axe, laying him out. On the other side, a giant spider was darting among the other trio, and it took Finian a moment to realize that spider was Morrigan. She jumped up on tables, and at one point climbed the wall, to dodge the soldiers' sweeping blades. One soldier's arm was stuck to the staircase banister by a clump of webbing. All the while, Percival engaged the leader with sword whirling. He moved with the ease and precision of a dancer, even while his eyes were hot and clouded with that anger that sometimes overtook him. Mila wasn't faring quite as well. She ducked and dodged to try to keep out of range of her opponent's mace, but he kept closing in. Knowing that Mila worked best when given some distance, Finian popped his daggers out of their wrist sheaths, and threw one into the side of the man's neck. He thanked all those nights spent sneaking out to practice that it actually connected, though it didn't sink in very far. It served to distract the man, though. He turned toward Finian, ripping the dagger out of his neck and tossing it aside. In 3 steps, he had advanced on Finian and took a swipe at his head. The elf attempted to jump back, out of the chair, but his leg buckled as soon as he put weight on it. He tumbled to the tavern floor, and the man looming above him smirked in triumph. Then, a sword swung in low from one side, and Finian saw the knight he'd noticed earlier taking the soldier's legs out from under him. A moment later, there was a Dalish arrow in the back of his neck, and the soldier began coughing and wheezing, obviously choking on it. Finian winced and scooted across the ground toward the soldier. He then used his remaining dagger to properly put the man out of his misery. Once that was done, a gauntleted hand reached down and helped Finian to his feet. He nodded his thanks to the knight, leaning on the stranger while his bad leg bucked and trembled under him. The rest of the fight seemed to be proceeding in a similar fashion. The knight's Templar friend had joined the fight alongside Morrigan, facing off against 2 soldiers at once while the Morrigan spider darted in to gnaw on their backs. Meanwhile, lightning streaked across the room as Khazar fought off 2 simultaneously, though Garrot kept getting between the soldiers and the mage with his dagger and axe, never letting them get in sword range of the magical powerhouse. As Finian watched, an arrow sprouted from the chest plates of one of those enemies, telling Finn what Mila was up to. Percival, however, stood against the leader alone, the pair cleaving out an empty spot in the crowded tavern as they fought wildly. As Finian watched, Percival smashed his shield into the other man, sending him stumbling back, then followed it with a stab that would have been lethal, had the soldier not deflected it off his own shield. The stab was returned, but Percival batted it aside with a growl. Lightning streaked from Khazar, who had downed his opponents, to the one the Templar was fighting, and then Morrigan pounced upon the last of her group and bore him to the ground, shredding his armor to pieces with her mandibles. Percival surged forward, smashing into his opponent once again and moving too quickly for the soldier to get his guard back up. Just like that, the leader was on his knees with the noble's sword at his throat. Okay. You win. The man gasped. Finian's heart jumped in his throat when he saw the expression on Percival's face, and realized that the human had no intention of stopping there. Percy, no. He's surrendering. Percival growled fiercely, and for a moment, Finian thought he'd ignore the words and kill the man anyway. Finian tried to step forward, but could only groan and clutch onto the nameless knight as his leg gave out again. But then, Percival tossed sword and shield on the floor with a clatter, and reached down to pick up the soldier by the front of his chest plate. He slammed the man into the nearest wall with such gusto that dust fell from the rafters. You take a message to Loghain, Percy growled, an inch from the other man's nose. The soldier could only nod, obviously terrified of what he was seeing in the noble's eyes. You tell him that the Grey Wardens know what really happened. And we will not stand idly by while the debt of all those deaths at Ostagar remains uncollected. You tell him that we are coming for him. Is that clear? The man nodded again, wide-eyed. Percival held him to the wall for a couple seconds more. Then, he contemptuously dropped his prisoner and stooped to pick up his sword and shield. The leader and the 2 soldiers left alive scurried out of the refuge without another word. Finn bit back a shiver that wasn't entirely fear as Percy's darkened gaze swept past him. The noble certainly was, intense in the heat of battle. Dangerously so. There was a clatter and a thump, and Garrot climbed on a table and addressed the rest of the tavern. Unsurprisingly, everyone was staring, either fascinated by or afraid of the battle that had broken out in their midst. Anyone else have a problem with Grey Wardens? Garrot rumbled flatly to their silent audience. This prompted the staring faces to turn hurriedly back to their business, and sound slowly began to emerge in pockets around the tavern again. The minstrels were starting to play again as the knight helped walk Finian back to his seat. Thank you, for that, Finn said. I'd be 2 halves of an elf instead of a whole one, if not for you. The knight smiled wryly. They were obviously the aggressors, and it looked like you and your friends could use the help. We were doing just fine, Khazar said, moving to lean back against the wall with arms crossed. The rest of the wardens were converging back on the original table as well. I'm sure you were, the Templar said, following now human Morrigan back to the group. His dark eyes narrowed under brown brows as his gaze darted between the two mages. Am I to understand that both of you are Grey Wardens, and not just apostates using them for protection? You can understand whatever you like, Morrigan said dismissively. You stepped in to help us, after all. We owe you no explanation. Henrik, the knight said calmly, we're not here for that. The knight turned back to the group. I am Ser Donal of Redcliffe, and this is my traveling companion, Ser Henrik. We've no quarrel with the wardens. The Templar nodded, lips still pressed together. I'm Finian, the elf said, gingerly lowering himself back into his vacated seat. And these are Garrot, Percival, Khazar, Morrigan, and Mila. He met Donal's eyes questioningly. Is it true, then? Loghain has declared us traitors. Yes. That bastard, Percy growled, slamming a fist on the table as he sat down. Finian laid a hand on his arm to calm him. We don't believe it, for what it's worth, Donal assured him. Nor did my lord, before he took ill. Truth be told, one of my comrades was recruited into the wardens not long ago. Ser Jory, Finian guessed. Donal looked surprised, then smiled. Yes. You know him. He was recruited in the same wave we were. He paused, feeling his heart sink at the man's hopeful expression. I'm sorry. He didn't make it. Khazar made a disgusted noise, and Finn hoped he didn't mention the manner of Ser Jory's death. Donal's face fell, but then turned wry. We'd thought as much, when we heard what happened at Ostagar. Though, like I said, we have doubts about Tairn Loghain's version. Good on you. Garrot had slipped back into his original seat across from Finn. Have a drink on us, since they'll go to waste otherwise. Donal laughed lightly. No, I made the mistake of drinking here the other day. Won't be doing that again. Garrot shrugged and took a swallow from his mug. Wow, looks like we missed a bit of excitement, a familiar voice said from the entrance, rising above the tavern's renewed noise. And I thought we were having fun in the chantry. Then again, I never do have much fun in the chantry. Finian smiled up at Alistair in greeting, which the blond man returned with a nod as he and the other wardens wound through the tavern toward them. Finian noted that a red-headed chantry sister seemed to be trailing behind the three. Both she and Felicity were staring at the bodies around the tavern with wide eyes. Alistair? Ser Donal asked. You're all right. No thanks to Loghain, Alistair said dryly, then nodded in greeting. Good to see you, Ser Donal. What are you doing in Lothering? Oh dear, you hadn't heard. That was a phrase that was rarely followed by good news. Judging by the look on Alistair's face, he knew that too. What is it? Eamon is sick. Very sick. They've tried potions and magical healing, but all to no effect. Lady Isolde sent us out to search for the urn of sacred ashes, in hopes that that may heal him. The sacred ashes? The remains of the prophet. Felicity said, drawing even with the table. It is said to merely be myth. If not, I can't imagine that an urn could have stayed intact for so long when there are so many factions that would seek to possess such a thing, even if only for its symbolic power. That's not true, said the priestess who had followed them in. Finian was surprised to hear that she was Orlshian. It is said that Andraste's most faithful disciples secreted the ashes away and hid it. Any true believers would have made certain such an important relic was well protected. I'm sure of it. Or they may have run away with it and gotten felled by a dragon, said Morrigan, thus smashing said sacred artifact upon the rocks and scattering these holy ashes upon the four winds like so much dust. So sad, I'm sure. That is one concern, Ser Donal hedged. Who's to say such ashes would be able to do anything, anyway? Percival said, staring darkly at his hands. Who says Andraste was special at all, and not just completely mad? The Templar and the priestess both gasped, and Alistair goggled. Finian was himself taken aback, to hear such things from Percival. Khazar barked out a laugh. I don't know about Mad, but I always did say she was an unholy bitch for what she did to us mages. She was also the Shemlin who freed our people from the Imperium, Mila said, staring stonily at Khazar. Yeah, and then condoned the domestication and imprisonment of every mage in Thetis. Forgive me for not praising her for putting me in one form of slavery instead of another. Guys, this is off topic, Finian broke in, seeing several people ready to verbally pounce on the mage, and, in Ser Henrik's case, possibly physically. He turned to Marnin, who only stared back at him flatly. How was the chantry? Any luck? No, she said shortly. It seems their hands are tied, what with our new status as outlaws. One you seem to have already discovered. She waved at the bodies that the tavern servers were now going about disposing. Nothing like an old-fashioned tavern brawl to say, "Welcome to town," Garrot said with a chuckle. Alistair, however, was still distracted by Ser Donal. How long has Eamon been sick? A couple weeks, Donal said with a sigh. He just grew tired and stopped eating, and now no one can wake him. Is there anything we can do to help? Morrigan groaned. We are not going to go all the way to Redcliffe on some personal quest of yours, are we? Alistair scowled at her. Eamon is a good man, and one respected at the land's meet. Further, his forces never made it to Ostagar, though I suppose now we know why. When he recovers, he can help us. With more than just forces, Percival said thoughtfully. He glanced back at Alistair. He's Kaelin's uncle, King Merrick's brother-in-law through his wife. I remember that. And further, King Merrick always deferred to him in matters of state. Alistair stared at Percival, and his voice wobbled a bit as he asked, You knew King Merrick? Finian studied Alistair, wondering at the ex-Templar's strange tone of voice. Percival shrugged. I never met the man personally outside being introduced once as Bryce's second son, but, yes, I've seen him meet with the other nobles, when my father could get me to sit still enough to watch the royal court in Denerim. He frowned thoughtfully. Tairn Loghain met with him often, and so did Arleman. He can help us against Loghain. This Loghain man did us wrong, Mila said, but he is not our primary enemy. The Darkspawn are our enemy, and should remain our focus. We won't be able to focus if we're in hiding from common lawmen, Percy argued. We need to take care of this business with Loghain. I take it he's running Ferelden through his daughter. He looked at the knight for confirmation. Donal nodded. He's declared himself Anara's regent, and is currently ruling in her name. Wait, explain this to me, Marnin broke in, frowning. What right does Loghain have to claim the throne? I was given to understand that the kingship up here was hereditary. It is, usually, Alistair said. Thing is, Queen Anara was the king's wife, wasn't she? And her father just happens to be Tairn Loghain. Had he no heirs? Not as such, no. Marnin made a noise of understanding. Ah, so King Kaelin's death not only paves a path to power for him to point the finger at us, but it also vacates a throne that has no clear successor. Marnin sighed. If I know anything about politicians, this can only lead to civil war. And just why would a warrior, Khazar said with narrowed eyes, know anything about politicians? Garrot, for some reason, laughed. Eamon is respected and Kaelin's uncle, Alistair repeated. I know him, he's a good man. If anyone can speak for us, it will be him. Problem is, he needs to be able to speak. Which he can't do if he's unconscious. I hope you are not suggesting we track down this relic of yours, Morrigan said snidely. No, just that we keep him in mind. When we're making plans. Percival nodded. Agreed. Well, we'd be happy for the help, Donal said. If you're staying for a couple days, Henrik and I will be in the chantry. Scouring the library in hopes of tracking down a relic no one has seen in 1,000 years. I'll help, if you like, Felicity offered. I'm quite good at scouring libraries. Donal smiled. If you've the time, we'll take all the help we can get. With that, he and Ser Henrik excused themselves and left, although not without Henrik casting suspicious looks back at Khazar and Morrigan. The wardens clustered around the table spent a moment in silence. Then, Marnan climbed into the spare spot at the table and picked up a tankard. This anyone's. Finian shook his head. Marnan gave the ale a taste and wrinkled her nose, but then tipped her head back for a hearty swallow. Setting the tankard solidly back on the table, she said, "We have our work cut out for us, it seems. We are the only Grey Wardens left within 100 miles. It is up to us to stop the Dark Spawn, and now we've lawmen to dodge as well." "Sounds like fun," Garrot chuckled. "At least between the lot of us, we've got plenty of experience doing both." Finian raised his tankard to taking impossible odds and rigging them into a win. Garrot chuckled, and both dwarves clinked their mugs with his in toast. 38 The Caged Cunnery. That afternoon, the Wardens and their rather attractive duo of camp followers staked out a camping spot in a clearing, slightly outside the city of refugee tents. All the while, Garrot derived no end of amusement from the way the Dalish elf was glaring at the newest of their number. Mila's stony facade had gained a couple cracks since their first encounter, the elf warming to the other Wardens until most of them received a lukewarm response from her most of the time, with perhaps a few degrees in either direction depending on whether you asked her intrusive questions about her people, solely Felicity, at this point, or did something she disapproved of. However, this Leliana girl was obviously categorized back under Shemlin in the elf's mind, an unfamiliar outsider who was to be mistrusted and subtly blamed for everything that had ever happened to the elves. Thus, Garrot's amusement. The Wardens were getting quite practiced at setting up camp by now, even the ones who had never had occasion to do so in their previous lives. As was usual, Mila proved the most adept at finding the perfect spots to pitch the tents and dig the fire pit. Between her direction, and the combined efforts of Percival, Marnan, and himself, they managed to get the tents erected. This was in spite of the fact that Alistair had his hands full with Finian, who was crashing fast. The pickpocket slumped against the ex-Templar, his injured leg completely limp. He seemed to have trouble keeping his eyes open. Finally, once the cluster of their tents had been arranged around the small site, Alistair ducked into one of the tents and eased Finian onto a bedroll. Felicity scurried in after them. "Morrigan," she called, "you should come help me take a look at Finn. It'll be a wonderful learning opportunity." "Exciting indeed," Morrigan said with a roll of her eyes. Even so, she sashayed her way over to the tent and followed the healer in. Alistair settled outside the tent with a sigh. "Well, this has been an exhausting day. Anyone else think Finn has the right idea of it?" "What?" Garrot said with a smirk, laying in a tent with two young, attractive women tending to his needs. "If only we could all be so lucky." Alistair's eyes widened and his face went red. However, Percy, Khazar, and, surprisingly, Leliana all laughed. Marnan gave Garrot an incredulous look. "You have a thing for human mages, then?" Garrot shrugged and grinned. "Apparently. If it is all the same," Mila said, shouldering her quiver. "I would prefer not to idle about camp when there are things to be done." "Let me guess," Alistair said sarcastically. "You want to run off into the woods and go hunting?" She gave him that ice bitch look of hers. "The humans in the town lack for food, correct? It was my duty in my clan to provide. I see no reason that the Shemlin here should not benefit from that." Alistair looked genuinely shocked. Is that why you kept bringing all those animals to the Ostagar camp?" She turned from him without answering. "If any of you wish to come along, feel free." "I think I will," Percival said with a sigh, gathering his shield from where he'd set it. "If only to help you carry your kills. It will help keep my mind off things, at the least." Mila nodded and walked off into the woods. Percival trotted out after her. Marnan sighed. "I must admit, I don't like the idea of sitting around doing nothing, either." She paused and turned to Leliana. "Perhaps now would be a good time to familiarize ourselves with the town. Do you mind?" "You want a tour, yes?" Leliana grinned. "I will be happy to show you around. Anyone else want to come?" "Pass," Alistair said, dropping back into the dirt. "I wouldn't mind scoping the place out," Garrot said, and grinned at the sour expression Marnan cast him. "Sure, whatever," Khazar huffed. "Better than staying in camp alone with this idiot." "Oh, upgraded from Templar, am I?" Makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. Shut up, Templar. And there it is. Garrot was chuckling as the four of them headed out, winding their way back toward the town proper. Lelyana immediately began expounding upon the history of the town, something about trade routes, but Garrot tuned her out. Instead, as they wandered through the village, he was studying the town itself. The Grey Warden recruits had passed through Lothering on the way from the Mage Tower to Ostagar, but they'd only stayed long enough to spend the night at the inn. Garrot hadn't had the chance to properly case the town. And with so much chaos and only a handful of Templars keeping order, any given residence wouldn't have been hard to burglarize. Not that Garrot thought doing so would actually be worth it, not now, when everyone was selling their earthly possessions just to feed themselves. Still, old habits died hard. Do people actually live like this? Khazar asked, squinting around at the admittedly unimpressive houses. If you think this is bad, Garrot said, I should bring you to my part of Orzammer sometime. He saw Marnan glance back from where she walked beside the human. What? And get robbed as soon as I stepped in? No thanks. Garrot chuckled, because the elf had the right of it. You are from Orzammer, then? Lelyana asked. The four of them had stopped in a narrow avenue among the houses. Refugees still clogged the streets, but not as much as the main thoroughfares. Marnan and me both. Where else would a dwarf come from? Lelyana shrugged. The ones I've met in Orlais all grew up on the surface. I've never known one that actually came from underground. But now it seems I know too. It is hardly something to get excited about, Marnan said, frowning up at the human. You speak of us as if we are some novelty. Oh, sorry. I meant no offense. Marnan sighed. No, I'm being unfair. It has just been a grading day. Garrot arched an eyebrow at her. You still upset about the elf? At Khazar's hiss, Garrot amended, the other elf. Marnan looked away, then snapped back, her face heating up. I would not expect you to understand, Braska. However, in my part of Orzammer, talking people into doing things that will ultimately be their undoing is practically a sport. Far more than the provings. It's despicable, and I'd thought I'd left that all behind. No. I get it. Garrot rubbed his hands over his cornrows, remembering his own first impressions of the elf. I knew someone a little like that, too. My boss, actually. Could talk a snake into eating its own tail. And yet Finian does not bother you. Of course he does. Garrot shrugged. I sniffed out the elf's puppeteering ways before you did. But the thing is, I don't think he knows his own power. He doesn't know he's being manipulative. How can he not know? Marnan cried. Same way Felicity doesn't know how nosy her questions can get, and Khazar doesn't get how nuts he sounds when he laughs mid-battle. Hey. I'm right here. People don't see themselves clearly. It's up to everyone else to shine a mirror on em. Marnan eyed him. That is, surprisingly astute. He smirked. What, for a piece of casteless scum? She paused, then sighed, and looked away. I was going to say for a thug, but I suppose I would have meant the same thing. She turned back to Garrot. I take your point. Mirror reflected. I suspect I owe you an apology for all. He waved her off. Nah. I don't need it. Besides, if you apologized, then I might have to too. And we both know that ain't gonna happen. He swore he saw the beginnings of a smile spark across her face before she turned away. Then, she started back through town, and the other three followed. Lelyana was looking between them with an eerily knowing smile, and Khazar just looked bored. Not enough burning things for his taste, probably. They resumed their tour of the village, and Garrot followed in silent thought until they reached the edge of Tome opposite the refugee camps. There, he spotted something that made him pause and move in for a closer look. What is that thing? Khazar asked, obviously spotting it too. A cunnery, Garrot grunted distractedly, moving up to stand in front of the cage. The other three followed him, all while the large man inside looked at them flatly. They make them fearsome fighters. My boss used to keep a couple cunnery mercenaries on hand, for when heads really needed busting. Marnan turned to Lelyana. Why is he in this cage? The revered mother said he murdered a whole family, even the children. Marnin's face, of course, showed only horror at the thought. Garrot, however, was intrigued. He turned back to the Cunary and asked curiously, "Did you do it?" At first, it didn't seem the creature would answer. Then, yes. Flat. Matter of fact. That is all we need to know, then, Marnin said, and made to leave. However, Leliana, of all people, stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. He is to be left here, to the mercy of the dark spawn. No one deserves that, not even a murderer. Garrot chuckled. Glad to hear you say that, lay sister. Then, he turned his attention back to the cage. He ran his hand along a metal bar, feeling the familiar chill of it. You know, I was stuck in a cage once. Spent 3 days there before I broke me and my buddy out. Not for murdering a family, but the way everyone acted, defiling the proving was just about even with it. Defiling the... Marnin's shocked voice said. That was you? You are the duster who defeated the warrior caste's best. Damn straight, princess, Garrot laughed. And I don't regret a moment of it. Marnin was silent for a moment. I honestly regret that I missed seeing that fight. He was surprised by the words, but chose not to acknowledge them until he could analyze them a bit more. Instead, he turned his face up to the Cunary. So, do you want out? No. Again, Garrot was surprised. He'd never known a convict who didn't jump at the chance at freedom. What? No. This is my atonement. You mean? Khazar said quizzically, you're sorry for what you did? No. Such feelings serve no purpose. Khazar stared at the Cunary, his eyes narrowing. You're weird. Garrot, however, could feel those gears in his own head turning, a plan hatching. So you want to atone? What if there was another way, besides starving in a cage or being torn apart by dark spawn? The Cunary just looked at him, but didn't shoot him down. Garrot decided to take that as a good sign. See, we're Grey Wardens trying to stop the Blight. And we kinda need every sword we can get at this point. What do you say? The Cunary looked at him flatly for a moment. I had heard the Wardens were mighty warriors. Clearly, not all rumors are true. Oh, that's it. Khazar's hands lit with fire, but Marnin stepped between him and the cage. We are not warriors of legend, Cunary, Marnin said. That is why we would have you join us. At this one, Garrot turned to her in surprise. You agree with me, do you? She met his eyes flatly. He expresses a desire to atone for his crimes. It is a point of honor that we should provide him with the opportunity to do so. Garrot smirked. To the Cunary, he said, so, if we let you go, will you fight with us? So be it, the Cunary said. You can't possibly trust him. Khazar cried, hand still sparking. Meanwhile, Garrot slipped his picks out of his pack and started tinkering with the cage lock. Marnin turned on the mage, lips pursed. He wishes absolution for his wrongs. From what I've heard of your past, you wish no such thing. Khazar's eyes narrowed on the princess. What I did wasn't wrong. Precisely my point. The tumblers slipped into place with a click, and the cage door swung open. So it is done, the Cunary said, stepping out. You may call me Sten. You have freed me, and so I will fight with you against the dark spawn. That will be my atonement. All his sentences were terse and direct. However, Garrot wasn't interested in someone friendly, like this Leliana woman. They needed strength and power, and a Cunary could deliver that in spades. Though first, he supposed, they'd have to get both of them some gear. 39 Not like other Templars. Of course Elfrit is important, but 'tis hardly the only herb in the woods, now is it? But none of the books I've studied on the subject mention cattails as a legitimate herbal supplement. No. I don't suppose they would they? Morrigan's knowing smirk might have been infuriating, if Felicity hadn't been so fascinated by the information the witch was imparting. They had been in Lothering for 3 days now. In that time, Felicity had had plenty of time to make good on the deal struck with Morrigan back at Ostagar. She had taught the witch a basic heal spell and what few spirit spells she could pull off, like the shield. Morrigan, in return, had proved to be a font of information in her own right. The other mage's shape-shifting abilities, for example, were fascinating to Felicity. She had badgered the other mage with questions over the last week about what it was like to wear another form. In response, the witch had merely rolled her eyes and answered something along the lines of, "You will never know." That did not stop Felicity from continuing to ask, of course. Morrigan was tolerant of the attention, at least, perhaps flattered, even. The same could not be said of Sten, who was the other main source of interest in their camp. Felicity had never seen a cunnery, of course, and mentions of them were surprisingly scarce among the reading material allowed in the circle. It was a pity, really, as any nation that could face the Tevinter Imperium was certainly significant in the larger picture. Yet so little was known about the Kossuth and their strange religion. At least, so little was known to her. She'd attempted to rectify that ignorance, of course. When the other wardens had walked him into camp, she'd peppered him with questions about the Kun and his homeland. He had tolerated it for a few minutes of spare, single-sentence answers, then had cut her off with a terse, "This is pointless," and had walked away. Garrot and Khazar had both burst out laughing. In the 3 days since, it had been a source of both frustration and fascination, and she wasn't certain which emotion she should feel more strongly. Now, Morrigan and Felicity were wandering the woods just southeast of Lothering, collecting herbs to replenish their stocks. Alistair trailed behind them, looking thoroughly bored as he stared up at the sky. "Alistair," Felicity teased, "I do believe escorts are meant to keep an eye on their surroundings. Or do you expect an attack from a wily nimbus cloud?" Alistair's lips quirked. "Just keeping an eye out for stray dragons." He tipped his head forward to aim that roguish smile at her, and she felt her face go inexplicably hot. "Can't have them swooping down and gobbling up our healer, right?" "Oh please," Morrigan groaned. "You, on the other hand. I think I'll let them eat you. Then I'll probably laugh." "How very chivalrous." "Be nice," Felicity scolded, though she didn't really expect either of them to listen. They'd been at one another's throats since their first meeting, after all. Or so the others had told her, as she'd been otherwise occupied during that particular event. Morrigan harumphed and resumed gathering cattails. Alistair, however, stepped up alongside Felicity as she collected the leaves off an aloe plant. "So what nefarious mage use will you put this plant to?" Felicity smiled. When he waggled his eyebrows, it turned into a giggle which she quickly stifled. "Aloe is most commonly used for soothing burns." "Oh, sign me up for that. Especially if I'm going to be squatting with Khazar in the near future." Felicity couldn't fight back a laugh at her fellow mage's expense. "It can't be that bad. He seems to think friendly fire means setting his friends on fire. And he loves doing that, let me tell you." "Yes, he did always have a habit of such things back at the tower. Being rather careless about the well-being of his peers, that is." Felicity gingerly worked off a branch, careful not to waste any leaves. Most of us other apprentices wondered why Jowan followed him around, when no one else could stand the little horror. With the revelation that Jowan is a blood mage, I suppose it makes sense. Obviously, Khazar made him bleed, making it easier for Jowan to practice his magic. Wait. Khazar's only friend was a blood mage? That explains so very much. She laughed. Doesn't it just? Morrigan could be heard muttering something under her breath not far off, but both of them ignored her. "What about you?" Alistair said. "Did you have any tagalongs, blood mage, or otherwise?" "Oh, no. No, I didn't really have any close friends growing up. I was far too shy." That made Alistair stop and give her a quizzical look. "You, shy? You?" She laughed, moving on to the next plant. "It's true. I've always related better to books than to people, and I'm afraid most of my peers found me quite intolerable. The enchanters who taught my classes liked me well enough, but I've never really connected with any of my peers on a personal level." She cut off a branch. "The only two people who ever seemed to genuinely care about me beyond my schoolwork were Wynne and Cullen." "Ah, right. Wynne was that mage at Ostagar, right?" Felicity nodded. Not for the first time, she felt a pang of worry about how her mentor had fared. The mages wouldn't have been on the front lines. They might have made it out. And Cullen? Was that another shy apprentice? She shouldn't have brought him up. Already, guilt was stirring in her stomach. She straightened from her herb collecting, glancing at Alistair to see that he watched her curiously. Actually, he's a Templar. Alistair's eyebrows shot up. A Templar took an interest in you? How, exactly? Did he hurt you? What? No. Cullen would never have hurt me. Felicity felt her face heat up again, this time in embarrassment. Quite the opposite, actually. What do you, oh. Alistair's own face went red, and he stared at Felicity. Are you serious? You, with a Templar? Nothing so untoward as what you're thinking. Felicity protested. By the Maker, she could have curled up and died of mortification right there. We never got that far. He didn't allow it. But if he had, you would have. Perhaps. She studied Alistair, trying to read the tension in Alistair's shoulders. Alas, she wasn't sure why he looked like he'd been hit with a paralyzing spell all of a sudden. It's hard to say. We were, well, sweethearts, I suppose. How did that happen? He asked softly, his eyes still masked. I'm not quite sure, to be honest. It just sort of fell together. She shook her head, a fond smile coming at the memory. When he was first stationed at the tower, fresh out of training, he was constantly stuttering and dropping things around me. I thought he was maybe a bit lyrium-addled, to be honest, and made it my business to help him about his duties as the charitable person I was. Little did I know that his bumbling was nerves, and my proximity only made things worse. Still, he was unbelievably sweet, and I often got the feeling that he watched me not with intent to guard the world from me, but rather to guard me from the world. Then, I was selected for my harrowing. Her smile faded. As you may know from your own training, it is a process we must go through, to weed out those apprentices without the mental acuity to become full magi. The Templars take the selected mage apprentice out of bed in the middle of the night and bring them up to the top of the tower. There wait a number of mages, including the first enchanter, and a greater number of Templars. One of those Templars is afforded a spot right next to the magical font where the ritual will take place, and it is he or she who is tasked with the duty of slitting your throat should you fail the harrowing and fall to the demons of the Fade, or even if you simply take too long. Alistair was staring at her, wide-eyed. When I walked into the harrowing chamber, my stomach all tangled with nerves and my mind abuzz trying to dredge up every little magical fact I'd ever learned. I crested the stairs to see Cullen standing next to the font. The look on his face as I approached, he was so very frightened. His eyes were pleading with me to be strong enough for this, but he was also proud of me, for being afforded this chance. It was that which made me set aside all the theoretical babble that my mind was tangled up in, and to forget the fact that, for all my good grades, my actual spell abilities were really not strong enough to warrant a harrowing, and to instead simply dive in and do it. It was only afterwards, as I was moving my things to my new quarters with the other mages, that Cullen finally came in and said it. He stopped by to help me carry my belongings to my new room and, over the course of 4 trips, confessed that he had always had a crush on me, and that he had been so relieved not to have to kill me that he simply had to let me know so, as a point of honor. She smiled fondly at the memory of Cullen's flustered face as the words tumbled out of him, occasionally stuttering and uncertain, but still carrying their own brand of assurance and strength. And that's when you got together? Alistair asked. Oh, no. No, I hadn't previously even considered the possibility, though he was certainly kind and handsome enough. But Cullen was always very dutiful, and would not have accepted any actual actions on such feelings. Even as I warmed to the idea over the next weeks, he refused to acknowledge me and took pains to avoid me, obviously embarrassed over his slip. It seemed that every time I turned around, I was catching glimpses of him escaping around a corner in the other direction. So you found the one thing a mage can do to truly frighten a Templar, Morrigan's voice said. Even she had paused in her foraging to listen. Bravo. I think I shall have to try that. She eyed Alistair pointedly. Don't even think about it, the ex-Templar said. Still, Morgan continued. I take it you must have forced a confrontation at some point, since this Templar of yours was obviously too much of a scared little boy to do it himself. I did. Felicity felt her cheeks flare up again, wondering why she was saying all of this. To make it hurt less, perhaps? By this time, I had realized that I reciprocated his fondness, and thus thought it unproductive for the two of us to stumble over ourselves avoiding the subject. So, I cornered him while he was on nocturnal storeroom duty, a relatively secluded post, and forced an acknowledgement of our mutual affections. What? Alistair said sharply, did you walk up and kiss him or something? Felicity felt her face go so hot that she wished she was any good at ice magic, just to cool it. Morgan burst out laughing. You didn't you? Alistair's expression was incredulous. You, a mage, walked up to an on-duty Templar and laid one right on his lips. Felicity, do you have any idea how dangerous that is? She tried to will her blush away. It's not as if I made a habit out of doing such things. If anyone had seen you. I know, Alistair. Colin said much the same thing. He'd been both horrified and delighted by the kiss. Felicity could remember his strong hands resting uncertainly on her upper arms. But as I assured him, I had made quite certain that we were alone, for the moment, and, unless he intended to do something quite a bit more involved, we would notice someone coming in long before they noticed us. She smiled. He turned completely scarlet at the mere words. Frustration over your insanity, no doubt, Alistair grumbled. A Templar, of all people. Colin was hardly just any Templar. He was different. Felicity's face was burning. Besides, don't you think it isn't a little romantic? A mage and a Templar, caught betwixt duty and forbidden love. Romantic? Morgan scoffed. Try disturbing. Felicity twisted the sleeves of her robe. It was in dire need of a good wash, she noted. After that first kiss, things got away from us, a bit. We never set up any formal meetings or anything, but the tower was only so large, and thus we certainly ran into one another from time to time. And when we did, his protestations about duty and his vows as well as my own resolution not to let him distract me from my studies were thrown aside. Our eyes would meet this certain way, and then we'd be stealing off behind a bookcase for a kiss, or ducking into an alcove for an embrace. It went on like that for months. And then, the rumors started. They were innocuous at first, and no one paid them much mind, since mages are awful gossips. But then, Colin was called into the Knight Commander's office and given a stern lecture about the dangers of mages and the importance of duty. He told me later that no names were mentioned, but it was obvious that Grigor had heard something. And so, as the whole thing was my fault in the first place for drawing him into it, I realized it was my duty to push him back out. All it would take was for us to get a little sloppy, and we would be found out. Discovery was something neither of us could risk. Alistair nodded. He would have been ejected from the order, and you. Precisely. So, when I realized that the two of us could never work. She sighed, the next part making her heart sink. I called it off. I told him I could not afford the distraction, and it was better if we both forgot anything had ever happened. It broke his heart. She bit her lip. I don't think he ever did forgive me. And he was still stationed at the tower after that, wasn't he? Talk about awkward, Alistair joked dryly. Felicity winced. Yes, it certainly was. In all honesty, shortly after our falling out, word came that King Kalin was summoning mages to Ostagar. I wanted to go, because it would mean not having to pass him in the hall every day and pretend I couldn't detect the hurt under his helmet. And so, I studied. For weeks, I pored through the libraries and absorbed everything I could about darkspawn, and battle tactics, and anything remotely useful. I made my intentions clear to several of the senior enchanters, and most of them agreed that such things would certainly come in handy. However, in the end, I was simply not a strong enough spellcaster to go along. I never had been. Felicity. But then Duncan asked me to join the Wardens, and I jumped on the chance. It would take me away, completely and utterly. No more Templars. No more mage politics. No more him, still watching over me like a fool even though I knew it pained him to do so now. She shook her head and sighed, staring down at her sleeves. Would you go back? Alistair asked softly. To start again with him, I mean, since you're a Grey Warden now. Felicity thought about that. She supposed that, yes, she was no longer technically under the Templars' authority. It wouldn't have been quite as taboo to involve herself with Cullen now, though it certainly still would have violated his vows. Still, not the world-rocking, career-ending kind of violation. Now that she was a Grey Warden, she and Cullen could have had something of a future together. At long last, she shook her head. No. Setting aside the fact that I can hardly afford the distraction, what with the oncoming blight, I suspect this entire ordeal has had its toll on me, and will only continue to do so over the course of it. I'm not the same studious apprentice he stuttered over in the tower halls, and I wouldn't pretend to be. Alistair cracked a smile. Well, if it helps any, which it probably won't, I can't really say I much care about that, Felicity. I like the one who's right here. Behind them, Morrigan muttered something and stalked ahead. Felicity felt her blush shoot up to the tips of her hair. Thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. Alistair shrugged, but that lopsided grin was in full effect. You heal me when monsters stab me. That's not kindness, it's self-preservation. She laughed and turned to continue picking herbs. Then, thank you. That's a very selfish, shrewd thing of you to say, and you should be ashamed of yourself. You're a bad person, Alistair. Morrigan's voice called. At least I didn't use my feminine wiles to corrupt some poor Templar, he teased. I suspect, Alistair, that feminine wiles hinge upon the status of one being female. Therefore, if you had, I would be rather disturbed. Oh, no, you would not. You'd be fascinated, try to figure out how I worked. You'd probably try to dissect me or something. Felicity paused at that, then shot him her best approximation of a sly grin. The way he was grinning back, it was like the two of them were the only people in the world. You know, you may be right. Wardens. Alistair clasped his hands to his chest. Maker, save me from the curiosity of Felicity Amell. I promise, I will forever be boring and predictable, if it will keep her dirty magey hands off me. Oh hush. You could never be boring. As soon as she said it, her face flushed, again. Alistair paused in his jesting to give her a quizzical smile. You think so? Oh, for the love of Dash, Morrigan's voice shouted from up ahead, a frantic note in it. Bears, you morons. Bears. Felicity and Alistair whirled, and only then did they see the pair of large brown bears that were bearing down upon them from across a clearing. One charged right through Morrigan, and if she hadn't transformed into a cloud of insects, she would certainly have been crushed. The other came for them, and Alistair's switch into battle mode was absolutely breathtaking. His sword and shield sprang into his hands, and suddenly the laughing jokester was gone, replaced with a strong, protective knight. His arm swept back to move Felicity firmly behind him, and then he set his feet in the ground to receive the bear's charge. It lumbered up, roaring low in its throat as it rose onto its hind legs in front of them. Then, it let itself fall on top of the man. Felicity focused what healing magic she could, and began knitting his wounds from a distance, even as the bear's claws bit through his armor. Finally, Alistair managed to kick and wiggle his way free. He rolled away, and then jumped right back in. Felicity risked a look over at the other bear. It was caught in a swarm of insects, but didn't seem to be particularly hurt by it. The bear Alistair was fighting bayed in pain, and Felicity turned back to see that Alistair was repeatedly bashing his shield against its snout, disorienting it. He slashed at its hide, but his sword did not seem to be having much effect. Even worse, the other bear heard its fellows cry and started lumbering toward them, ignoring the flies. Felicity turned and shot a spell bolt at it, but the bolt was as weak as all of her offensive spells, and that only seemed to provoke the creature. It turned toward her and ran at her at a full-on charge. She could only watch, frozen in horror as the gigantic mountain of fur bore down on her. Felicity. Alistair fought to step to her aid, but his own opponent knocked him aside. Felicity shot another bolt at the charging bear, but the spell fizzled harmlessly against its fur. 3 more bounds, and she would be crushed beneath its massive paws. 2 more. 1 more. There was a rumbling bark, and a blur sprang out of the foliage and attached itself to the bear's neck. The bear roared and drew back on its hind quarters, close enough that Felicity could feel the spittle falling from its mouth. Hanging from the bear's throat by a powerful set of jaws was a gigantic, filthy maberry. It couldn't be. The dog growled and tightened its jaws, even as the bear thrashed and pounded at it. It seemed that the dog was weakening, but then a giant spider crawled up onto its back and added its own mandibles to the bear's throat. Between the two of them, the bear tumbled down with a final sputtering growl. Alistair, meanwhile, was still fighting off his bear. His right arm and back were a mess of scratches where the bear's strong claws had broken straight through his armor. Still, they were largely superficial wounds, and a burst of healing magic knit them up without any fuss. The warrior's sword plunged deep into the bear's hide, even as the Morrigan spider spit a glob of web into its face. The bear tossed about, but finally went down as Alistair smashed his shield over its head one more time. Finally, gasping for breath and splattered in blood, Alistair stepped back and noticed the dog. Andraste's knickers. Hugo. The Maberry hound raised his head, his tail wagging tiredly. Then, he whimpered and collapsed. Felicity and Alistair both rushed over to meet him. Ugh. What is that thing? This thing, Morrigan, Alistair bit out as Felicity knelt to inspect the dog, just saved our collective hides. So shut up for once, would you? Felicity ran her hands along the dog's back, regretting that she had never really studied canine anatomy. Hugo was an absolute mess. His fur was matted and burned, and caked with blood both black and brown. His hide was covered in a patchwork of scratches, many more than a week old from the look of it. Still, she couldn't feel any broken bones, as far as she could tell. And when she ran a hand along his snout to check for bruising, his tongue snaked out to lick her hand. Experimentally, she sent a burst of healing magic into him, and was surprised as it rushed through him as easily as any human, closing many of his worst wounds. The dog startled at the sensation, its head popping up with a growl. Easy, Hugo. I'm healing you. We can't take you back to Percival with you in this state. At the mention of his master's name, the dog's ears perked, and he abruptly jumped up with a happy bark. His tongue lolled out. I wonder where he's been all this time, Alistair said, studying the dog. Felicity only shook her head helplessly and scratched the dog behind the ears, sending more healing magic into him as she did so. Then, she wiped her hand on her robes. All I can say is that, wherever it was filthy. Let's stop by the stream before we take him back to Lothering, and see if we can't wash some of this off. That, Alistair laughed, sounds like an excellent idea. And since it's your idea, you can be the one to wash him. Alistair, I cannot say enough how very chivalrous and gentlemanly you are. I do try. Somebody kill me, Morrigan groaned. Hugo barked happily, and followed the rest of them as they turned back to Lothering. Fortykin, and other lies. As if the Leliana person couldn't get any more obnoxious, it turned out she sang, too. Khazar glared across the camp at her, wondering if he could make her burst into flames without being too obvious about it. She was currently singing for a bunch of the refugee children, who were gathered around her feet like ants over a dropped sweet. The songs were all stupid ones, about talking animals and griffin-riding warriors and, of course, Andraste. They were all children's songs, Khazar thought. Though, if he'd ever known any of those, he certainly couldn't remember them. Who'd want to anyway? They were completely inane. The Warden camp had become something of a curiosity among the refugees since their arrival in Lothering. To some, the Wardens offered hope. To others, the Wardens offered somebody to blame. To still others, the Wardens offered a pretty good bounty if collected, though Sten's greatsword and Garot's various well-hidden traps tended to dissuade that last group from actually acting upon it. Khazar sat near the fire pit in the afternoon sun, helping Garot and Finian sort through the many objects they'd salvaged from the abandoned belongings scattered around the village, and perhaps from some of the not-so-abandoned belongings, knowing those too. At least, Garot was sorting through the findings, his face heavy with concentration as he picked up bits of seemingly useless scrap metal and set them carefully aside into a separate pile. It was more of the dwarf's strange compulsion that Khazar had noticed long ago. Now, Khazar figured that Garot must use such things for the traps that currently kept scavengers from getting into their camp. Finian, however, watched Leliana, and he looked fascinated. Every once in a while, he'd hum along to a snippet the bard was singing, and Khazar had to fight with himself not to blast the other elf in the face in annoyance. The only thing stopping him was the fact that they'd spent 3 days here, waiting for Finian to heal. Khazar didn't need to make it longer. No matter how much he wanted to. Percy sat about 4 feet away from them, working on sharpening Marnin's axe. Next to him was a stack of armor and weapons that were in dire need of upkeep. Khazar didn't really understand how such things worked, since the only upkeep a mage needed to worry about was making sure he didn't waste all his magic on one spell. Included in Percy's stack were the suits of armor they'd scrounged up for Sten and Leliana. Sten's armor was mostly the cast-offs of the Lothering band's garrison, while Leliana's leathers had required some finagling on Finn's part with a rather ornery merchant. Khazar didn't get the point of going through so much trouble to get the bard armor when they let Mila strut around in practically her small clothes. The Dalish elf's bare belly button was just asking for a lightning bolt in it. The Dalish elf was out of camp on another hunting trip, and Felicity, Morrigan, and the Templar had left to go collect herbs. Marnin was in town something about helping the Chantry track down a missing amulet. Khazar honestly didn't care. Sten stood at the edge of the camp, stiff and silent. Just like he'd been the last couple days. The Cunnery was creepy, as far as Khazar was concerned. He was just so cold. Khazar didn't really understand cold people, being an elf of passion himself. And what he didn't understand, he liked to blow up in a ball of fire. Except no one was letting him do that. Ugh, it was just like being back in the tower. When could he go back to killing Darkspawn? Do you think it takes long to learn that? Khazar, Garot, and Percival all looked up at the sound of Finn's voice. He was still staring at the demmed bard. Khazar turned back to his work. Learn what, elf? Garot asked. By the Fade, every time the dwarf said that word, Khazar's hackles rose. How would he like it if Khazar said duster all the time? Finian waved a hand in Leliana's direction. That. The storytelling. The songs. And of course, the musical instruments. Finian positioned his hands as if strumming an invisible lute, his infamously nimble fingers dancing over imaginary strings. To inspire through song, and evoke joy or sadness with a well-placed note. Garot snorted a laugh. Something tells me you'd be a natural at it. Finn turned guileless brown eyes to the dwarf. You think so? Assuming you can carry a tune, of course. Finian grinned and turned back toward their supposed work. Then, he started humming. That wasn't an invitation, Khazar snapped. You can sing along, too, if you want, Finian said with a smile that made Khazar want to kick him. No, I can't. At that, Garot chuckled. Can't sing, eh? I sing fine. Musical studies is one of the cultural classes we were forced to take at the tower. Khazar looked away from them, glaring at Leliana as he said, more quietly, I just don't know any of these songs. Finian actually laughed. Everyone knows these songs. Right, Percy. The noble nodded distractedly. My caretaker, Nan, especially loved the ones where naughty little boys had nasty things happen to them. He smiled softly. Can't imagine why. Well, I don't, Khazar bit out through clenched teeth. Something in his voice made the others turn to look at them. Finian was immediately soothing. Well, what songs do you know? Khazar shrugged, staring into the fire pit. The great Tevinter cantatas. The 12 symphonies of Valroio. And more of the chant than I really tried to remember. Finian looked taken aback. Those aren't children's songs. Surely, you were dash. I don't know. But what did your mother dash? I don't know. Anger flared through him. But how could you dash? He spun on the nosy twit, magic flaring hot and wild in his hands. Because I don't remember my mother. The three of them were silent, even Garot's face registering shock at that statement. I was brought to the tower when I was 4. So no, I don't know any fucking children's songs. Now stop. talking about it. And so they did, the four of them falling into a silence that Khazar might have thought awkward, if he hadn't been so relieved. At least Finian wasn't humming along anymore. It was only after about 10 minutes that their silence was broken, when a bark could be heard above the singing of the children and Bard. Percival's head shot up. Was that a dog? Garrot finished with amusement. I didn't know what a dog was before Ostagar, but IDVE thought you would. No, that's not it. Percival set aside the cuirass he'd been working on and stood. I'd recognize that bark anywhere, but how could that be? As if on cue, a gigantic, wet dog bounded out of the brush. It slid to a stop at the edge of camp, barked once, and then barreled straight into Percy, knocking him into the dirt. Maker's breath. Hugo. While the noble was being mauled by an overzealous Maberry, Alistair emerged from the treeline near where the dog had come from, followed shortly by Felicity and Morrigan. They were all as wet as the Maberry, but the grins on Alistair's and Felicity's faces were self-satisfied. Oh, thank you, Maker, Percival muttered. You're all right. Thank the Maker you're all right. He clung onto the dog, water and all, and Khazar was taken aback to notice that the nobleman was actually weeping. Seriously? Over a dog? Khazar missed the Percival Cousland who had called Andraste a madwoman. That guy, at least, had had some fortitude. I think he was waiting for the right dramatic moment to show up, Alistair said cheerfully as the trio drew even with them. So that, when Felicity needed saving from being mauled by a bear, he could leap out of the bushes and maul that bear right back. You were mauled by a bear? Finian asked Felicity, eyebrows high. Actually, there were two of them, Felicity said. Though Alistair rather selfishly kept one all to himself. You know me, said the Templar. I'm selfish like that. Felicity says I'm a bad person. Felicity nodded sagely, and then they both laughed. Khazar silently groaned, because this looked to be the beginning of some sort of unholy pact between the two. They were bad enough individually. Percival sat up, but he still had one arm wrapped around the dog. Thank you, both of you. And Morrigan. 'Twas no doing of mine, she said dismissively. Although now that I know the mangy creature is yours and not Alistair's, I find myself far less repulsed by it. He's not mangy, Alistair said, leaning down to make a truly disgusting face at the dog. Are you, boy? Even so, Percival said, smiling at both of them. Wait, smiling, I can't possibly express how much it means to me, to have Hugo here again. He turned to the dog and said in mock reproach. You do realize you're never leaving my sight again, I assume. The dog wagged its tail and barked. I didn't know you had a Maberry, Leliana's voice said, and the bard came to stand next to Percival, her lute slung over her shoulder. The children she'd been singing to were dispersing, sped along by Khazar's glares at them. Oh, he's cute. Hugo's tongue lolled out. Don't let him hear you say that too often. It'll go to his head. Percy rubbed behind the dog's ears. And yes, I've had him since we were both pups. I sense a story. The bard sat down next to the pair, reaching out to pet the dog as well. This seemed to be a cue for the rest of them to settle in. Alistair sprawled out on Leliana's other side, and Felicity knelt over Garrot's pile to investigate their findings. Morrigan, Khazar noticed, hovered behind Percival, her lips drawn in a thin line. Well, there is a bit of one, I suppose. Percy smiled wryly, rubbing the stubble on his chin with the hand not clutching the dog. I got him when I was 13, although got is probably not the right term. He shook his head and continued. You see, the kennel master's favorite hunting hound had just given birth to 9 healthy, purebred Maberry puppies. It was all he ever talked about, how strong they all were, and what good things they'd do for our defenses. And so, being a curious sort of lad, I wanted to see them. Thing was, that wasn't exactly allowed. Maberry puppies are fiercely sensitive to the imprinting process. Not even the kennel master can come near them for those first weeks, or else they imprint on him and don't nurse correctly. So they have to leave the bitch alone with the puppies, and then walk the potential trainers into the kennels so the dogs will imprint on them. Hopefully, anyway. Maberries can be notoriously picky. Again, Percy scratched his hound fondly behind the ears, and the dog barked contentedly. Well, I'd never been one to let little things like rules and logic stop me from exploring. So, one night, I snuck out of my room and crept down to the kennels. They kept nursing Maberry in a back room behind the others, so I snuck in there and opened the door just a crack. Just to peek. By the light of my torch, I could see the mother, sleeping on a pillow, a bunch of soft little shapes cuddled up next to her. It was strange to me, that such big, powerful dogs could start out so small and soft. Curiosity satisfied, I closed the door and turned to go, but then I felt the softest little tug on my ankle. Leliana covered her mouth, giggling. Everyone else seemed to be fully into the story, too. Khazar, despite himself, found his curiosity piqued. I looked down, only to see a tiny Maberry puppy, no bigger than a cantaloupe, gnawing on the bottom of my pajama pants. He snuck out while the door was open. Finian asked. Percy shrugged. I can only assume so. Obviously, I panicked. This was the kennel master's prize litter, and I had inadvertently let one out of the room. I reached down and grabbed hold of him, but it took me a while to pry him off my trousers. And then, as I picked him up, he only latched onto my thumb. Percy rubbed at his right thumb, looking at Hugo fondly. Strong jaws, even back then. Sten, who was watching them out of the corner of his eye, made a low hum sound. Khazar jumped and stared at the giant suspiciously as Percy went on. Again, creepy. I rushed back to the room and opened the door, but when I tried to put him down, he wouldn't let go. I managed to pull him off, but as soon as I set him on the ground, he ran back out again. I tried to get a hold of him again, but he just kept running around me and then latched right back onto my pant leg. I practically had to kick him back into the room before I finally managed to get the door closed with him on the other side of it. I snuck back to my room with my heart in my throat, now more sure than ever that I didn't want to get caught. But no one was up, so I got back to my room safely, and soon forgot about the entire thing. Except you were imprinted, Alistair guessed with a smirk. Percival nodded. A couple weeks later, the kennel master started going about imprinting the dogs. The knights who wanted a hound could go in first, followed by the rest of the Cousland garrison. Those that were lucky would get one right away, otherwise they would simply have to try again with the next litter. But after a couple days, some of the dogs just wouldn't imprint. This wasn't unusual, since some Maberry are pickier than others. So, the kennel master decided to walk the unbonded dogs through the castle and see if any of the men struck their fancy. I happened to be in the courtyard with Father, Fergus, and a couple of my father's men, practicing my sword work at the time. And so, when the kennel master came out into the courtyard with the unbonded dogs, one of the puppies started going crazy. He barked and wagged his tail, and generally acted how a Maberry usually does after a long separation from its master. Kind of like how he did just now. Finian teased. As a matter of fact, yes. The thing was, that reaction was very obviously the action of a dog that had already been imprinted. The kennel master was confused, because this puppy in particular had shown no interest in any of the possible candidates. Still, he went ahead and untied the dog's leash. And so, imagine everyone's shock when the puppy bounded straight up to me while I was in the middle of a drill and barked in greeting, tail wagging. Next thing I knew, everyone burst out laughing. I'd gotten a bit of a reputation as a miscreant by that time, so it was immediately obvious to everyone what had happened. Percival's smile was wide and warm with memory. My father had to drag me to my mother so that she could scold me, because he was laughing too hard to properly pull it off himself. Percy, Finian chuckled, I had no idea you were such a troublemaker. Nor I. Morrigan mumbled thoughtfully. Percival shrugged. I probably could have given even you a run for your money, elf, back when I was at my worst. Father always said the Maker made me the perfect second son. He and several others laughed. Khazar just scoffed, admitting silently to himself that perhaps he just didn't get the joke. And it didn't help his temper at all that Cousland was now saying the E word too. You're lucky you got to keep the dog, Alistair said mournfully. Imprinted or not, where I grew up, my caretaker's wife would have whisked the puppy away, that's for sure. Felicity's head popped up. That's terrible. Khazar twitched. Hello, Circle Tower, much? I can't really blame her or anything, Alistair said with a shrug. See, I was a bastard without a father, and Arleman took me in and raised me. I'm pretty sure she was worried I was Eamon's son. But to not let you have a puppy. Khazar threw his head back and groaned. By the fade, can we stop talking about the damn dog? Alistair gave him a sour look. You're just upset you never got one either. No, I'm sick of listening to all these life stories. He couldn't take it anymore. Just, all of you shut up. Magic surged through him, unbidden. Just shut up. Khazar. Fucking Felicity. No, just no. What are all of you, priests taking confessions? If I have to hear one more person talk about their parents, or their cousins, or some bleeding heart noble who took them in, I am going to personally make every last child in this town explode, just out of spite. Arg. He could feel the torrent inside him surging through, and so he blasted a puff of fire into the fire pit and turned to storm off into the forest. Footsteps scurried behind him. Khazar, wait. Felicity's voice called. He whirled around and shot a fireball, and only Felicity swiftly erecting a spell shield saved her face from being burned off. She stared at him from behind the shield in shock. Stop, Amel. Just stop it. You are not some older sister who has to loom over me all the time, scolding me for cursing or chewing with my mouth open. I don't want you in my life, so back the fuck off. Khazar turned back around and continued toward the tree line. Call me when we cut this psycho-babble shit and get back to killing Darkspawn. The silence rang heavy behind him as he delved into the forest. Only when he was out of sight, and he was sure he wasn't being followed, did he let the magic in his hands go. He felt drained, and it had nothing to do with his magic. It was exhausting, being so upset, but why was he so angry? Gah, he never liked to analyze his own reactions to things. Doing so made him uncomfortable. He wandered his way through the woods until he found the stream that curved around to pass through the town. Here, it was 15 feet wide, the cool, clear water rushing past. He leaned down to splash some water on his face, hoping it would refresh him. All it ended up doing was make him notice his reflection. The Circle Tower didn't have a lot of mirrors. Vanity wasn't the sort of thing the Chantry approved of, so the apprentices tended to rely on their friends and bunkmates to tell them when they had a pimple or were looking exceptionally ugly that day. For that reason, Khazar's reflection always surprised him a little. He looked like an elf. It used to catch him off guard, when people referred to his race, but now he supposed it was what most people who didn't know him saw. His ears stuck out proud and pointed from among the spiky mess of his strawberry blonde hair. His hair was getting a little long, it was starting to get in his eyes. He usually asked Jowan to cut it by now. His face was still a field of fiery tattoos, and that, after the elf thing, was the first and only thing most people ever noticed about him. He preferred it that way, because otherwise they'd notice the soft lines of his face, or the delicate point of his nose, or his gray eyes that had occasionally been compared to a woman's. Blast it, if anyone ever called him pretty again, he'd throw up. And then he'd turn them to stone. There was a noise across the stream, and Khazar looked up to see Mila picking her way along the opposite bank, her belt laden with various grouses. He wondered what she saw when she deigned to look at him. It wouldn't be the fact that he was an elf, at least not in any way that the others did. And probably not the tattoos, either. She had to be used to face tattoos, being Dalish. So what did she see? A mage? Or a kid? Or something else completely? And why did he care? Oh, thank the Maker. Other elves. And here I was worried we'd have to avoid more humans. Khazar spun his head, and saw an elven woman emerging from the trees, a crate of dishes clasped in her arms. Behind her was a young girl with her hair all done up in braids. The girl carried a bundle of dirty cloth, likely laundry. Both woman and child were looking from Khazar to Mila and back, relief on their faces. Mila, who had been studying the ground directly across the stream from Khazar, stood up straight and said, "Andoran audition." Khazar thought that might have been a greeting. "Have the humans in Kemp been giving you trouble?" "Oh, no. Nothing more than the usual. Still, it makes doing the laundry uncomfortable, to have them leering at us. As if we don't have the right to wear clean clothes, too. The woman knelt down next to the stream. The girl openly stared at both of them, standing just behind the woman's shoulder. Mother and daughter, Khazar realized with a pang. Then don't let them leer, Khazar snapped, standing up from the stream. If someone gives you a hard time, you stand up and give it right back. The woman's eyes widened. Oh no, we dare not do that. It may be different where you're from, but here among the humans, elves have been put in prison for less. Why? Khazar cried, no longer able to contain his building frustration over the entire matter. Human or elven, what does it matter? It's just the blasted shape of our ears. The mother and child stared at him in awe. Mila, however, looked utterly horrified, which Khazar supposed was an improvement over her usual wall of ice. Is that truly all you think we are? Mila asked slowly, as if having difficulty processing that. Shemlin with pointed ears? Do you not know of your own history? History is dead and gone, he spat back. I don't see how it matters either way. But, have you no sense of heritage? He threw his hands up in the air. What do you want me to say? That I've always longed for the kinship of other elves? Because I haven't, Mila. There were only a handful of us in the tower, and the only thing we had in common was the fact that we had to work twice as hard as any of the humans to gain any respect, all because of your so-called heritage. My sense of identity lies in the fact that I am a mage, and a damn formidable one. I don't need any inane kinship from strangers who happen to have the same ear shape. He spun and started away from the stream. He grew so tired of storming off, but he heard Mila hiss something in a dead language behind him, and then she was suddenly in front of him, blocking his path. Her feet weren't even wet from crossing the stream. How had she done that? And what of when that magic fails you, Dalithalan? What are you then? It won't, he growled, though the memory of Grigor's hand on his neck, snuffing out his magic, sprang to the forefront of his mind. Magic is what you do, not what you are. I do hunting, and that perhaps makes me a hunter. But I am a member of the Sabre clan of the Dalish, and I am one of the Elvaean, and I am one of the chosen of Andruil. These are core parts of my being that cannot be taken from me by any means. Can you say the same, Dalithalan? He couldn't, not with the renewed memory of Templar anti-magic dancing in his mind. So, instead, he focused on something else. Stop using that language. It's dead. Why don't you understand that it's dead? She started away, approaching the elves who still watched them from beside the stream. It will not be dead so long as there are those among us who remember, she said firmly. As you, obviously, do not. Neither do you. You're not some immortal keeper of ancient lost knowledge. You're, what, 10 years older than me? Tops. Mila did not answer right away. Instead, she offered one of the kills at her belt to the woman. Only after the woman had nodded her thanks did Mila turn back to regard Khazar. Now, there was actually some expression in those usually stony eyes. Sadness. And pity. It was ridiculous. No one pitied him. The things he did warranted respect and fear, not pity. Perhaps it is that you do not know what it is to be one of the Elvaean. But whether you acknowledge or not, Dalithalan, you are, and it will always be so. What does that word mean? The nameless elven woman asked. Little cousin, Mila answered, not taking her eyes off Khazar. For kin is what we are, whether he accepts it or not. He does not need to face everything alone. A knot was tightening in his throat. Like a noose. I don't need your kinship. Yes, Dalithalan. I think you do. He wanted to blast her, but he couldn't seem to summon the appropriate anger to do so. So instead, he spun on his heel and stormed off into the forest, away from her pity and her kinship and her stupid dead language that rang true with something distant and faded inside him. And if his storming looked more like running after a while, no one was there to see it. And if that burning in his eyes hinted at tears threatening to fall, well, he would vehemently deny it later, even to himself. Check the description for the links to the author.